Elizabeth Carter was already on her knees in the mud, hands working the broken spoke, rain soaking through her coat, while the man who owned that carriage stood frozen helpless, watching two terrified horses tear themselves apart in the harness. She fixed his wheel that night. She saved his horses. She walked home alone in the dark, and she never once knew that the man standing over her in the rain was hiding a secret powerful enough to change everything she had ever believed about her own life. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel, follow Elizabeth all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain came hard that evening, the way Virginia rain always did in October. Not politely, not gradually, but all at once, like the sky had made up its mind and saw no reason to announce it first. Elizabeth Carter pulled her shawl tighter and kept walking. She had 3 miles left between herself and home, and she was not going to run. Running was for people who had something to prove. Elizabeth had stopped proving things to people a long time ago. She was 24 years old, and she had been managing her family's farm since she was 16. She had buried her mother at 17. She had watched her father's hands get weaker every winter, watched the soil get harder every spring, watched the neighbors stop coming around when there was no longer a man of the house strong enough to entertain them. She had learned to fix fence posts in the summer heat. She had learned to read land surveys so no one could cheat them at county records. She had learned to barter with the grain merchant in Staunton without flinching when he tried to give her less than the harvest was worth. She had not learned to be afraid of rain, so she walked, and then she heard it, a crack, sharp as a rifle shot, and immediately after the panicked screaming of horses. Elizabeth stopped. She didn't think. She didn't deliberate. Her feet turned toward the sound the same way a compass needle turns north without argument. 20 yards off the main road, half obscured by the overgrowth of a bend in the trail, a carriage had gone sideways. Not tipped fully, but leaning hard. One wheel collapsed at a brutal angle, the axle grinding against the wet earth. 2 horses thrashed in their harness, their whites showing nostrils wide. A man in a dark coat struggled at their heads, speaking low and fast, trying to calm them with his voice, while his boots slid in the mud. There was a driver, too. Older man, heavyset, sitting on the ground beside the rear wheel with his hand pressed to his knee, like something had gone wrong there. He wasn't getting up. Elizabeth reached the horses first. She didn't announce herself. She stepped directly to the left horse, the one fighting harder, and placed both hands flat against its neck. She didn't grab. She pressed. Steady pressure right below the jaw, where the pulse ran fast as creek water after a flood. "Easy," she said. Not a command, not a plea. Just a word placed carefully like a stone set in the right spot to stop an erosion. "Easy now. It's only rain. You've survived worse than rain." The horse trembled, but it stopped pulling. The second horse followed the way horses always did when one of them decided the panic wasn't worth it anymore. The man in the dark coat exhaled. He'd been holding that breath for what sounded like a full minute. "That was," he started. "Your driver," Elizabeth said, already turning. "His knee. Is it broken or just wrenched?" The man blinked. I'm not certain." "Then let's find out." She crossed to the driver and crouched beside him without ceremony. The older man looked at her with the expression most people wore when Elizabeth Carter appeared, and started doing things a mixture of surprise, mild offense, and reluctant gratitude. "Can you press down on it?" she asked him. "I can try, miss." He pressed. Winced hard, but the joint held. "It's not broke, just twisted something fierce when I jumped clear." "Stay off it," Elizabeth said. "You'll make it worse if you try to stand before it settles." She stood up and walked to the collapsed wheel. The axle had held. That was the first thing she checked. A broken axle in this mud, in this rain, at this distance from town would have been a true problem. But it was the wheel itself that had given. One of the spokes near the hub had cracked through, and the iron rim had torqued under the weight of the carriage body, pulling the whole assembly out of true. She studied it the way her father had taught her to study a problem. Don't panic about what it looks like. Find out what it actually is. "Do you have tools?" she asked without looking up. The man in the dark coat had come to stand nearby. He was watching her the way people watched things they couldn't quite categorize, with attention that didn't quite know what to do with itself. "There's a kid under the driver's bench," he said. "Rope wedges, I believe, a mallet. Get them." He got them. He didn't argue. He didn't say, "Are you certain about this, miss? Or perhaps we should wait for someone more." More what? She had never been able to finish that sentence when people left it hanging. He simply walked to the carriage and came back with a canvas roll of tools. Elizabeth opened it on the ground. Rope, 2 wooden wedges, a mallet, a short iron bar that could be used as a lever if you understood leverage. Not ideal, but workable. "You're going to have to help me," she said. "Tell me what to do." She looked up at him, then for the first time really. How was tall. Broad across the shoulders in a way that had more to do with work than with fashion. His coat was fine enough that she registered it the way you register weather as simple fact. But his hands, when she'd seen them at the horses' heads, were not the hands of a man who only wore fine coats and did nothing else. There were old calluses on those hands. There was something in the set of his jaw that she recognized without being able to name. Howe was somewhere near 30. Dark hair plastered down by the rain. Eyes that were, she catalogued this quickly without interest, a particular shade of gray that looked almost blue in low light. She did not think he was handsome exactly. She thought he was present, which was different and rarer. "I'm going to wedge the axle up," she said. "When I tell you, you brace the carriage body from this side. Don't push, just hold. Keep it from settling while I reset the wheel. I understand. You'll need to hold it steady for at least 2 minutes." "I can do that." "It's going to feel like longer," she said. "Most things do," he replied. She went to work. It wasn't elegant. Mud in October never was. She drove the first wedge under the axle with the mallet, feeling the impact travel up through her arms, ignoring the way the rain was now coming down the back of her neck and soaking through her collar. She set the second wedge, tested. It adjusted the angle by a 1/4 inch, tested it again. "Now," she said. He stepped in and braced his shoulder against the carriage body. She felt the frame stabilize just slightly, just enough. She got the iron bar under the rim of the wheel and began working the joint back toward true. It resisted. It always resisted the first time, like it was testing whether you were serious. She was serious. She leaned into the bar with her full weight. Something shifted. She repositioned and pushed again. The wheel groaned a deep metallic sound and then seated itself reluctantly back into its proper angle. "Hold still," she said. She worked the rope around the hub and the lower spoke, creating a temporary bind that would keep the wheel from torquing out again. It wasn't a repair. It was a rescue enough to get the carriage moving again slowly for a limited distance, if the driver watched the road and the passenger had the sense not to push the horses. "That won't last more than 4 or 5 miles, she said, standing up and pushing wet hair off her forehead. "You need a wheelwright before you push it further than that. The spoke is cracked clean through. It'll go again on the first rough patch if you don't." The man was still in position, holding the carriage frame, watching her. "You can let go now," she said. He released the carriage and straightened. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain had eased slightly, not stopped, just reconsidered. "Miss," he said finally, "I owe you a considerable debt." "You don't owe me anything," Elizabeth said. She was already rolling the canvas toolkit back up. It was a wheel, not a miracle. "Most people I know would have walked past." "Most people you know then," she said, "weren't raised to do otherwise." She set the toolkit on the driver's bench and stepped back. The driver was watching her from his place on the ground, with an expression she understood well. He was the man of some years, accustomed to a certain order of things. A certain order in which women did not materialize out of rain and fix carriage wheels, while gentlemen held the frame and followed instructions. He wasn't offended exactly. He was recalibrating. She had seen that look her entire life, and she had made her peace with it. "Who taught you that?" the man in the dark coat asked. Elizabeth picked up her shawl from where she'd set it against the wheel. "My father. And before him, the man who taught my father. And before that, I imagined someone else." "You say it like it's ordinary." "Knowing how to fix things is ordinary," she said. Not knowing how is the strange part if you ask me. He almost smiled. She noticed it only because she was already turning away and caught it at the edge of her vision. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Home." "Which direction?" "South." She nodded down the road. "Carter Farm, about 3 miles." "We were headed towards Staunton," he said. "But the road runs south before it turns east. We could take you." Elizabeth stopped. She turned back to look at him. He was not offering out of obligation. She could tell the difference. Obligation wore a slightly apologetic face, like it was hoping you'd decline. This was something else. This was curiosity wearing a polite coat. She thought about 3 miles in the rain. She thought about her father, who would be waiting, who would worry, who would not say. He worried, but whose relief when she came through the door would be visible in every line of his face. "Your driver can't work the reins with that knee," she said. "No," the man agreed. "Then I'll drive," Elizabeth said. There was a silence. "You drive as well," he said. "I do a great many things," she said simply. "Are you coming or not?" She climbed to the driver's bench before he could answer. His name, she learned over the next 3 miles, was Nathaniel. He told her that and nothing more, and she did not ask for more, because in her experience, people told you what they wanted you to know and kept the rest until they trusted you with it. She respected that. She operated the same way herself. She drove carefully, watching the road the way she'd told him to, keeping the horses at a walk, feeling for any vibration in the reins that would signal the wheel was threatening to go again. It held. She'd known it would hold if they were careful. She'd tied the rope correctly. Nathaniel rode inside the carriage for the first part of the trip. Then, after perhaps half a mile, she heard the door open and felt the bench shift as he climbed up beside her. "It's wet," she observed. "I noticed," he said. "You could ride inside." "I could," he agreed and said nothing further. They drove in silence for a stretch. Not uncomfortable silence, the specific kind of quiet that exists between two people who are both accustomed to thinking before speaking and have each recognized that quality in the other. "Carter Farm," he said eventually. "Is that your family's land?" "Has been since my grandfather's time," Elizabeth said. 12 acres more or less. Good soil on the east side. The west gets flooded in heavy rain years." "Do you manage it yourself?" "My father and I," she said. "My father's hands aren't what they were." She paused. "I manage it." "That's a significant responsibility." "It's just work," she said. "Most things people call significant are just work if you look at them directly." Howe was quiet for a moment. She had the feeling he was deciding something. "Do you go to Staunton often?" he asked. "When there's business," she said. "Grain sales, county records. Last spring I went to dispute a boundary survey that the Hendricks property had filed. They'd moved the marker line 3 feet into our eastern field. Took me 4 visits to the county clerk's office before they corrected it." 4 visits, he repeated. "The first 3 times they told me to send my father," she said without particular bitterness. It was simply fact, the way weather was fact. "The 4th time I brought the original land grant documents, the 1798 deed, and a written account from 2 neighboring landowners who'd witnessed the original marker placement. They corrected it that afternoon." Nathaniel was quiet. She didn't elaborate. There was nothing to elaborate. That was just how things worked, and she had learned to work within how things worked while quietly working to change them, one county clerk at a time. "You said your grandfather time," he said. "Your father, he's a Carter by birth." "Thomas Carter," she said. "Born 1769. He came to Virginia from Pennsylvania with his father when he was 11 years old. Spent 40 years building that land. He deserves to see it kept." Her voice did not waver. "So I keep it." Something shifted in the way Nathaniel was sitting almost imperceptibly, but she felt it through the bench, like he had straightened slightly in response to something. "Your father is fortunate," he said. "We're fortunate in each other," Elizabeth said. The lane to Carter Farm appeared through the rain. She turned the horses without being told where to turn. She knew this road, the way she knew the lines on her own hands. "This is me," she said, and pulled the horses to a stop. She handed him the reins and climbed down before he could offer to help. She didn't need help climbing down from a bench she'd been climbing up and down since she was 10 years old. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that same expression she'd caught at the edge of her vision earlier. Something between assessment and recognition. Like he was seeing something he hadn't expected to find in this particular place, on this particular road, on this particular rainy evening. "Thank you, miss," he said. "You quite literally saved us tonight." "The wheel would have held another mile," she said. "Maybe. The horses wouldn't have," he said. "Not without you." He paused. "I didn't catch your name." "I didn't give it," she said. Then, because she was not unkind, just careful, "Elizabeth Carter." "Nathaniel," he said again. Just the one name, just as before. "Good luck in Staunton," she said. "Good luck with the Westfield," he replied. "In heavy rain years." She was already walking toward the house. She did not look back, but she heard the carriage start moving slowly, the horses finding their pace again. And she heard she might have imagined this, she told herself later, and then told herself she had probably not imagined it. She heard him say something quiet to the driver. Something she couldn't make out. And the driver laughed. Not meanly. Not the way people laughed when something was ridiculous. The way people laughed when something surprised them into feeling warm. Her father was at the window when she came in. Thomas Carter was 61 years old and looked older by at least a decade. The kind of older that honest work and hard winters and grief accumulate in the joints and the lines around the eyes. He had not been a large man, even in his youth, and age had reduced him further, but there was a quality to his attention that Elizabeth had inherited and recognized. He noticed things. He noticed them and held them quietly and turned them over and rarely said what he was thinking until he had thought it completely through. He looked at her wet clothes, at the mud on her hands, at the calm expression on her face that meant something had happened. "The Johnson family?" he asked. The Johnsons were the nearest neighbors, and trouble at the Johnson place was the most statistically common explanation for Elizabeth coming home late. "No," she said. "A broken wheel on the Staunton road." He nodded slowly. "Anyone hurt?" The driver wrenched his knee. The wheel was repairable temporarily. "And the passengers?" She moved to hang her shawl near the fire. "One man, traveling to Staunton." "Anyone we know?" "No," Elizabeth considered. "A man named Nathaniel," she said. "I don't know his family name." Her father was quiet for a moment. "What did he look like?" "Tall, good coat, calluses on his hands despite the coat." She paused, thinking. "He did what I told him to without making a discussion about it. That's not common." Her father's expression moved in a way she couldn't quite read. Something passed across it, not quite recognition, not quite something else. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "I'm glad you're home safe." She studied him for a moment. Thomas Carter was not a man who said nothing when he meant something except on the rare occasions when the something was too complicated to release yet. She let it go. She hung her shawl. She rebuilt the fire. She checked on the horses in the barn, the way she always did last thing, because the horses deserved that consistency. She came back in and found her father had made tea, weak tea, the end of their supply, and left a cup on the table for her. She sat down. She thought about the man named Nathaniel and his gray-blue eyes, and the way he had said most things do when she'd warned him that 2 minutes would feel like longer. She had met men who talked like that before. Men who had a quality of experience in their speech, who said things that landed with more weight than the words alone. Usually those men had earned that weight the hard way. She thought about him for exactly 3 minutes, which she knew because she watched the clock on the mantel. Then she stopped. She had a Southfield to check before dark tomorrow. She had a letter to finish to the grain merchant in Staunton. She had a fence post on the east line that had been wobbling since August, and she had not yet had the time to address it. A man named Nathaniel with good hands and a broken wheel was not part of any of that. She drank her tea and went to bed. 3 days later, a horse appeared at the end of the Carter farm lane. Elizabeth was in the barn, mending a harness with leather cord, and more patience than the project deserved when she heard the sound. She came to the barn door and looked out. A single horse. Well bred, she could see that from 30 yards. The kind of horse that cost money, not the kind of money that farmers spent, but the kind that moved differently, that carried itself with a specific quality of ease. And on the horse, the man from the road. He was wearing a different coat today. Still fine. He had removed his hat. The gesture was directed at the farm in general, or perhaps the sky, as if acknowledging that he was arriving at someone's place, and that required a certain courtesy. Elizabeth set down the harness. She walked to the yard. "Mr. Nathaniel," she said. "Miss Carter," he said. "I hope I'm not intruding." "That depends on why you're here," she said. He had the grace to almost smile at that, a small contained thing, the kind of smile that lives at the corners of a mouth. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said. "I realized our parting on the road was abrupt." "It was raining," she said. "It was. But still." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "I also brought this." She took it, unfolded it. It was a receipt from Hadley's wheelwright in Staunton dated 2 days prior. The receipt had been made out to Carter Farm. She looked up at him. "I had the wheel repaired properly," he said. "But I also noticed when I came into Staunton that Hadley's had a spoke and rim assembly that would fit the type of axle used on most Virginia farm wagons built in the last decade." He paused. "I took the liberty of describing your wagon from what I could see of it when I passed your lane, and Hadley assures me the parts would fit. He's holding them at a discount against this receipt if you'd like them." Elizabeth was quiet. She read the receipt again. Then she looked up. "I did not ask you for this," she said. "No," he agreed. "You didn't ask me for anything. That is precisely why I came." She was not a woman who cried easily. She had not cried easily since her mother's funeral, when she had understood for the first time that some losses were permanent and that the world would require her to function within them anyway. But something moved in her chest at those words, something she did not acknowledge and did not allow to reach her face. "Mr. Nathaniel," she said, "I don't know who you are or where you're from or what your circumstances are. I fixed a wheel because it needed fixing, and I knew how. That's all there was to it." "I know that," he said. "That is not a reason to refuse gratitude." She considered him. How was not uncomfortable under her consideration. Most people were. Most people, when Elizabeth Carter looked at them steadily and said nothing, shifted their weight or found something to look at that wasn't her face. This man held still. She folded the receipt and put it in her apron pocket. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she said. "My father usually takes it at this hour." A beat. "I would," said Nathaniel. Thomas Carter's reaction to Nathaniel was the most interesting thing Elizabeth had witnessed in recent memory. Her father was a composed man. He had met plantation owners and county officials and traveling merchants and circuit preachers, and he treated all of them the same way, politely, attentively, and with a specific quality of reserve that meant he was watching and thinking, and would tell you what he'd concluded only when he was good and ready. He greeted Nathaniel the same way, except for the one moment. They had been sitting at the kitchen table for perhaps 10 minutes, her father and Nathaniel talking about the tobacco market in a general neutral way that men used when they were trying to understand each other without revealing too much when Nathaniel mentioned in passing that he had recently come from Richmond. Thomas Carter set down his coffee cup. It was a small movement, a careful movement. "Richmond," he said. Not a question, just a repetition like he was placing it. "I have business there periodically," Nathaniel said. "What sort of business, if you don't mind my asking?" "Land and property management," Nathaniel said. Thomas Carter nodded once, slowly. That unreadable expression crossed his face again, the same one Elizabeth had seen 3 nights ago when she'd told him about the man on the road. "Well," her father said, "it's a busy city." That was all he said. The conversation moved on. Elizabeth watched her father's hands around his coffee cup, steady, unhurried, and thought he knows something. She did not ask him what not yet. She was patient. She had been patient her whole life. She would wait until he was ready. Nathaniel came back a week later. He had a reason. He was passing through again on his way north, and the Staunton Road ran past the Carter Lane, and he wanted to make sure the carriage wheel parts had been useful. This was the reason he gave, and it was the kind of reason that was technically true and simultaneously beside the point, and Elizabeth Carter was too perceptive not to know it. But she let him give the reason, because she had to admit to herself, not unhappy he had come. He stayed for 2 hours that time. He sat with her father and listened to him talk about the Carter land with an attention that was not polite performance. Elizabeth knew the difference. She had been watching people pretend to listen her entire life, and she knew what real attention looked like. Nathaniel asked questions that demonstrated he had actually heard the previous answers. He laughed twice at things her father said that were genuinely funny, and not at things that weren't. And when Thomas Carter's hands began to tremble, as they did now in the late afternoon, when the fatigue of the day settled into his joints, Nathaniel did not pretend not to notice. But he also did not make a thing of it. He simply shifted the conversation to something that required less from her father's hands and more from his voice, which was still strong. Elizabeth, who had been doing that for years, noticed. She noticed it with the same precise attention with which she'd noticed his calluses on the road. She was building something in her mind, an accounting of who this man was, independent of whatever he had or hadn't told her. It was the way she approached everything. Find out what a thing actually is, not what it presents itself as. What Nathaniel presented: a traveler, a man of business, quietly educated, comfortable with silences. What Nathaniel actually was she didn't know yet. But the gap between the presentation and the reality felt deliberate. Not dishonest. She didn't feel dishonesty from him, just withheld, like the last name he still had not given. She thought about that. She thought about it again that night after he had gone, and her father had watched the road where he'd ridden out of sight for a moment longer than necessary. "Papa," she said. Said Thomas. "Who is he?" Her father looked at her. In the firelight he looked younger somehow, or maybe it was that he looked the way he had when she was small, and he was protecting her from something she didn't yet know was coming. "Why do you ask?" he said. "Because you've known something since the night I mentioned him," she said. "And I am not going to pretend otherwise, and you are not going to insult me by pretending I haven't noticed." Her father was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There are things I'm not certain about yet. Let me be certain before I speak." Elizabeth looked at him. "All right," she said. She trusted her father's certainty. She had learned to. But for the first time in a very long time, she found herself impatient for it. He came back a third time. This time, there was no pretext about passing through on his way north, because it was a Wednesday, and the road north was not the road past the Carter Lane on a Wednesday. He came directly. He arrived at mid-morning when Elizabeth was in the east field checking the fence posts, and he came to find her there instead of waiting at the house. She heard his horse and looked up. "You're persistent," she said. "I've been told," he replied. He dismounted and tied the horse to the fence and came to where she was working. She had a post driver, a heavy iron cylinder on 2 handles, and she was resetting the post that had been wobbling since August. "Can I help?" he said. "You can hold the post straight while I drive it." He held the post. She drove it. It took 7 strikes to seat it correctly, and he held it perfectly steady through all 7 without being asked to adjust. "Better," she said. "Much better," he agreed. They walked the rest of the fence line together. It was not a romantic walk. There was nothing romantic about checking fence posts for weaknesses in October mud, but there was something in it that she could not entirely dismiss. The ease of it. The way he matched his pace to hers without making an adjustment about it. The way he asked questions that were actually about the farm, about the soil, about the drainage problem on the west side, and listened to the answers with that same quality of real attention. "You know about drainage," she said at one point, when he'd said something more technically precise than the occasion required. "I've had reason to learn about it," he said. "From managing land," she said. "Yes." "Whose land?" she asked. He looked at her sideways. "Mine, eventually. Family land." "Family land," she repeated. "Where?" A pause, brief but real. "East of here," he said. She stopped walking. He stopped too. She looked at him directly, the way she'd looked at the county clerk when he'd told her for the third time to send her father. Level. Clear. Without hostility, but without any softness that could be mistaken for acceptance. "Mr. Nathaniel," she said, "I have told you my name. I have told you my father's name. I have told you the history of this land and the size of it, and the trouble with the West Field. I have given you coffee twice, and my time more than twice. I am not a fool, and I am not a child. So I would like you to tell me simply and directly, what is your full name, and why haven't you given it?" The field was quiet. A crow somewhere in the oak stand along the east border. The wind moving through the dry grass. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted. Not collapsed, shifted. Like a thing that has been held at a certain angle for a long time and has been gently but firmly placed on level ground. "My name," he said, "is Nathaniel Whitmore." Elizabeth said nothing. But she felt it, a cold clarity settling through her, the way cold water settles through warm. She had heard that name. She had heard that name in county records and grain merchant conversations, in the careful pauses people made when discussing who owned what in the Shenandoah Valley. Whitmore, the Whitmore family. "You are," she started. "I am," he said quietly. She turned and walked back toward the house. He followed. He did not try to stop her, did not call after her, did not try to explain while she was moving away from him. He simply followed at the distance she was establishing with her pace, and waited. She stopped at the fence by the lane. "You let me talk to you," she said, not looking at him. "For 3 weeks. You came back 3 times. You sat with my father. You held my fence post. And the entire time you knew that if you'd given your name on the road that first night on the road in the rain, when I was on my knees in the mud, fixing your wheel, I would have—" She stopped. She made herself say it. "I would have handled myself differently." "I know," he said. "Then why?" "Because I didn't want you to handle yourself differently," he said. "I wanted to know who you actually were, not who you became when you knew who I was." He paused. "Do you understand the difference?" She stood with her hands on the fence rail and did not answer for a moment. She did understand the difference. That was the thing she couldn't allow herself to be simply angry about, because she did understand it. "I would not have treated you poorly," she said finally. "I don't treat people poorly based on their name." "I know that now," he said. "I didn't know it on the road." She was quiet. "Elizabeth," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name. He said it carefully, like it was something that required handling. "I have known a great many people in my life who acted one way when they thought no one of consequence was watching, and another way when they thought someone was. I have spent a great deal of time wondering which version of a person was the true one." He paused. "You are exactly the same person in the mud fixing a wheel as you are in a kitchen drinking coffee. I have been looking for that for a long time." She turned to look at him. He held her gaze. "I am still angry," she said. "You have every right to be," he said. "I have questions." "I'll answer them," he said. "All of them, whatever you ask." Elizabeth Carter stood at the fence line of her family's land her grandfather had built, that her father had worked, that she had fought for in rain and in county clerks' offices, and she looked at Nathaniel Whitmore, whose family name meant more in this valley than she could easily dismiss, and she thought about honesty, about what it cost, about who was willing to offer it even when it wasn't comfortable. "Come back Saturday," she said, "and bring your family name with you from the start." She walked to the house without looking back. Behind her, she heard the sound of a man breathing out a long, slow exhale, the kind that comes after something has been held too long and finally released. She kept walking. But she was already quietly forming the questions she would ask on Saturday. She did not yet know that those questions, once asked, would open something far larger than a dishonest introduction. She did not know what her father already half suspected. She did not know what was buried in the Carter family history and in the Whitmore family records, and in the careful silence of a man named Clara Bennett, who had been watching all of this from a distance with the particular anxiety of someone who has a very great deal to lose. That was still coming. But on that Friday night by the fire, Elizabeth Carter made tea and thought about a man who had wanted to know who she actually was. And for the first time in a long time, she thought that perhaps that was enough of a beginning. Saturday came the way October Saturdays in Virginia always did, cold enough to mean business, bright enough to make you think you could handle it. Nathaniel Whitmore arrived at 8 in the morning, not mid-morning. Not at a gentlemanly hour that suggested he'd considered whether to come at all. 8 o'clock, which meant he'd left wherever he was staying before sunrise, which meant he had not slept easily, which meant something. Elizabeth noted all of this from the window before she opened the door. She opened the door. He had his hat in his hands. He was holding it the way men held hats when they were trying to demonstrate that they understood they were on uncertain ground, not twisting it, not fidgeting with it, just holding it, like an offering and an acknowledgement at once. "You came," she said. "I said I would." "People say a great many things," she replied, and stepped aside to let him in. Her father was already at the table. Thomas Carter looked up when Nathaniel entered, and something passed between the two men, a look that Elizabeth could not fully read, which frustrated her because she could read most looks. It was the specific look of two people who are circling a shared knowledge from opposite sides, each waiting to see how much the other will reveal. She filed that away. "Sit down," she said. "Both of you." They sat. She poured coffee and sat across from Nathaniel and looked at him directly. "You said you'd answer questions. I have them." "Go ahead," he said. "How long has your family been in the valley?" "My grandfather came in 1778, Nathaniel said. "He bought the original Whitmore tract, 430 acres east of Staunton. My father expanded it. The property now runs to just over 1,000 acres. Thomas Carter set his cup down very carefully. Elizabeth heard it. She did not look at her father, not yet. "And what do you do with it?" she asked. "Crop farming primarily. Some timber on the northern section. I've been trying to diversify. The tobacco market is unreliable, and I think the valley farmers who are still putting everything into tobacco will be in a difficult position within a generation." He paused. "I've been moving the Whitmore land toward grain and cattle. Slower returns, but more stable." "That's not a common view," Elizabeth said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't. Most men in your position are still convinced tobacco is permanent." "Most men in my position," Nathaniel said, "haven't spent enough time actually working the land to notice what it does to the soil after 20 years of the same crop." She studied him. "You work your own land." "When I can," he said. "My father found it unnecessary. I find it essential." There it was again, that quality she had noticed on the road, the thing that didn't fit the coat. She pressed it. "Where were you going on the Staunton Road?" she asked. "The night the wheel broke." A beat. Small, but real. "I was returning from a meeting with a man named Clara Bennett," he said. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Thomas Carter's hands, which had been still on the table, moved. Just slightly. Just enough. Elizabeth looked at her father. Thomas Carter was looking at his coffee cup. "Papa," she said. "I know that name," her father said quietly. "Clara Bennett." "So do I," Nathaniel said. "He manages a set of property interests in the north end of the county. He approached me 6 months ago with a proposition, a land transaction I was considering." He paused. "I'm no longer considering it." "Why not?" Elizabeth asked. "Because the more I looked at the terms," Nathaniel said, "the more I found that several things Mr. Bennett had told me did not hold up when examined closely." He looked at Thomas Carter directly. "Including some things about the history of land transfers in this county going back 15 or 20 years. Thomas Carter raised his eyes from his cup. The two men looked at each other, and Elizabeth understood with the sudden cold clarity that came when puzzle pieces shifted into place, uninvited, that this was not the first time these two men had been connected by a name and a history. It was simply the first time they were in the same room to say so out loud. "Tell me," she said, to both of them, to neither of them. "Tell me what you both already know and have not told me." Her father spoke first. He spoke slowly the way he always did when the thing he was saying mattered, not because he was uncertain of the facts, but because he was choosing which ones to release and in what order. Charles Bennett, Thomas Carter said, came to this farm in the autumn of 1802. You were 8 years old. You remember he came? I remember a man in a gray coat, Elizabeth said. I remember you sent me to the barn. I did. Her father exhaled. He came to offer me a proposition. At the time we had a very bad year, the worst we'd had since your grandfather. The West Field had flooded 3 seasons in a row, and we'd lost nearly 40% of the harvest. I was carrying debt to the grain merchant, and I was frightened. He said the word plainly without embarrassment. I was frightened for this family. Elizabeth did not say anything. She had not known about the debt. She had been 8 years old. Bennett offered to buy a portion of the East Field, her father continued. Not all of it. A section, the good section, the elevated section, that doesn't flood. He offered a price that was lower than the land was worth, but higher than nothing, which is what we had. Thomas Carter pressed his lips together. I almost took it. But you didn't, Elizabeth said. I didn't, her father said. Because the week before I was going to sign, a man came to see me. A man I'd never met. He'd heard through the way people hear things in small communities that Carter Farm was in trouble. He came and looked at the land. He walked the whole east section, and he told me something Bennett hadn't. Thomas Carter looked at Nathaniel. He told you, Nathaniel said quietly, that the East Field sat on a limestone shelf that would make it drought-resistant, that it would outlast the neighboring fields in a dry year, that its value in a long drought would be 3 times what it was in normal years. Thomas Carter nodded. That man, Elizabeth said, was not you. No, Nathaniel said. It was my father. Silence. Real silence, the kind that has weight that you can feel pressing against your ears. Your father, Elizabeth said, slowly, came to this farm in 1802. He did, Nathaniel said. He told me about it before he died. He said he'd met a farmer on the Staunton Road, a man who'd helped him when his horse went lame, who'd given him water and walked 4 miles out of his way to find a smithy rather than leave him stranded. Nathaniel paused. He said he never forgot that kindness. He said when he heard that same man's farm was in trouble, he felt he owed a debt. Elizabeth turned to look at her father. Thomas Carter's jaw was tight. Not with grief exactly, with something older than grief. The particular tension of a man who has carried a knowledge for 15 years and has wondered every so often whether it would ever be spoken aloud. You knew who his father was, Elizabeth said. I suspected, Thomas Carter said. After. When I heard the Whitmore name in connection with land matters east of here. The man never gave his name, and I never sought it. He helped me, and I kept my land, and that was enough. He paused. I thought it was enough. And Bennett? Elizabeth asked. Her father's expression changed. The quiet grief hardened into something with edges. Bennett came back 4 years later, 1806. Different proposition, not buying this time. A lease arrangement for the north fence line. I turned him down. A pause. He came back again in 1809, and again in 1812, each time with a different arrangement, each time for the same piece of land. Thomas Carter looked at Nathaniel. What is he actually trying to acquire? Access, Nathaniel said. There's a water source on your north line, a spring that feeds into the creek that runs through 3 other properties east of here. If Bennett controls that water source, he controls the drainage rights for a significant portion of North County farmland. He paused. He has been quietly acquiring property around that spring for 7 years. Carter Farm is the last piece he needs. Elizabeth stood up. Both men looked at her. She walked to the window and stood there for a moment with her back to them. Not because she needed to see anything. She needed a moment to place what she'd just heard into the right order, to feel it settle into structure, because structure was how she dealt with things that were large enough to be frightening. Charles Bennett had been trying to take something from her family for 15 years. Her father had known it and dealt with it quietly. The Whitmore family had saved her father's land once already without ever being thanked by name. And now here was Nathaniel Whitmore in her kitchen 15 years later because a wheel had broken on a rainy road, or because something was pulling the threads of a longer story toward a conclusion that had not yet been reached. She turned around. "What does Bennett know?" she asked Nathaniel. "About you coming here." "He knows I declined his proposition," Nathaniel said. "He doesn't know why." "Does he know you've been coming to this farm?" A pause. "I don't know." "Then we should assume he does," Elizabeth said. "Because men like Bennett watch what they're trying to take. They watch who comes near it. They watch anything that could disrupt their plans." She moved back to the table. If he knows you've been here, and he knows you turned down his proposition, he's already trying to understand the connection." Nathaniel looked at her steadily. "You think fast." "I've had to," she said. It wasn't a boast. It was just the plain accounting of a life. "What do you want to do?" Nathaniel asked, and he asked it directly. Not "what do you think I should do?" Not what might be advisable, but what do you want to do, as though her answer was the governing one. Elizabeth sat down. "I want to understand everything," she said. "Every piece. Before we do anything." She spent the next 4 days doing what she always did when she needed to understand something. She gathered information with her hands and her feet and her patience. She went to the county records office in Staunton, the same office where she'd fought the boundary dispute, where the same clerk still flinched slightly when he saw her coming, because he remembered the 1798 land grant and the 2 neighboring witnesses, and the very quiet way she had placed the evidence on his desk and waited. She asked for the transfer records on the North County properties. The clerk said those records weren't easily accessible. Elizabeth said she had time. An hour and a half later, she had what she needed. Bennett had acquired 6 properties in 7 years. All of them in a rough arc around the north end of the valley. All of them with water rights included in the transfer documents. 3 of the transfers had been straightforward purchases. 2 had been lease arrangements that had quietly converted to ownership after the original landholders defaulted. 1 had been an estate sale following the unexpected bankruptcy of a family that had, according to county records, been in perfectly sound financial standing the year before. Elizabeth sat with those documents for a long time. She was not a lawyer. She had never claimed to be. But she had spent years reading land documents because land documents were what stood between her family and people who wanted what her family had. She knew how to read the shape of a thing, how to see what the words were doing underneath the words. The pattern she was reading now was not a legal pattern. It was a hunting pattern, and Carter Farm, its north fence line, its spring, its water access, was the final quarry. She carried her notes home on foot in her coat pocket, and she thought about it the whole 3 miles back. About her father, who had known and borne it quietly for 15 years, because he was the kind of man who did not alarm the people he loved until he had a reason to believe the alarm was warranted. About Nathaniel Whitmore, who had come down from 1,000 acres of valley land to sit at her kitchen table and answer questions directly. About Charles Bennett, who she had not yet met and already understood. She thought, "I am not going to let him have it. Not the water, not the north line, not 1 inch of this land that her grandfather had built and her father had worked and she had fought for in the rain and in county clerks' offices and in every ordinary day of the past 8 years. She thought it calmly, without drama. The way she thought that wheel needs rope or this fence post needs resetting. It needed doing. She would do it. She sent a message to Nathaniel through the grain merchant in Staunton, a practical arrangement she'd established because she had no other reliable way to reach him quickly, and because the grain merchant owed her a favor since she'd caught an arithmetic error in his ledger last spring that had been costing him money for 2 years. Nathaniel appeared at the farm the following morning. He came through the front gate at a pace that suggested he'd read urgency in the message, and when he saw Elizabeth waiting at the fence rather than at the house door, he tied his horse and came directly. "What did you find?" he said. "6 properties," she said. "I'll show you." She produced her notes. He read them right there at the fence, standing in the cold turning pages, with the same focused attention he gave everything. "The estate sale," she said, pointing to the 3rd page. 1811, the Halloran family. Do you know them? "I know of them," Nathaniel said. "Old family, good land. I was surprised when I heard they'd gone under." He looked up. "You think Bennett arranged it?" I think someone put pressure on their credit line at the right moment, Elizabeth said. I can't prove it from what I have, but the pattern is there. Nathaniel folded the notes and handed them back. You're right, he said. I've seen this before, not in this county, but I've seen the shape of it. He's patient. He doesn't take directly. He surrounds, and then he waits. He's been waiting on us for 15 years, Elizabeth said. Yes. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He may have been waiting for your father's health to decline further. Waiting for a year when the finances are tight enough that the offer looks more attractive. Elizabeth said nothing. She said nothing because that was exactly what she had already concluded, and hearing it spoken aloud made it more real than she wanted it to be in that moment. He is not going to get it, she said. No. Nathaniel agreed. He isn't. She looked at him sideways. You sound certain. I am certain, he said. Simply. Without embellishment. Because of your father, she said. Because your father came here in 1802. Because of more than that, Nathaniel said. He met her eyes. But yes, in part because of that. She accepted that. Not all of it, she was still too careful for all of it. But the part she could reach, she accepted. Then I need to know what Bennett said to you, she said. In the meeting before the wheel broke, everything, every word you remember. They walked the fence line while he talked. Bennett had wanted Nathaniel's water access. Not his land, not directly. What Bennett had proposed was a shared water rights agreement on the creek that ran from the North Spring through the Whitmore eastern section. He had presented it as a cooperative arrangement, a water-sharing compact between neighboring property interests that would formalize existing drainage patterns and give all parties legal clarity. Nathaniel had brought a lawyer friend from Richmond to read the document. The lawyer had read it twice and then said quietly in a carriage outside Bennett's office, this agreement would give Bennett the right to redirect the water flow from the North Spring within 10 years. The formalization clause is a mechanism. Don't sign it. Nathaniel hadn't signed it. He'd told Bennett he needed time to consider. And then, on the road back in the rain, a wheel had broken, and a woman with mud on her hands had appeared. He knows I didn't sign, Nathaniel said, when they had walked the full length of the east fence and turned back. He sent a courier 2 weeks ago asking if I had additional concerns he could address. I didn't reply. He'll try again, Elizabeth said. He will. And when he does, he'll be looking for leverage. She stopped walking. He's going to find out about you coming here. He may already know. Then we need to be further ahead of him than we are, she said. I need the water rights document on Carter Farm, the original deed notation from my grandfather's time. My father says it exists. I have to find it. Where would it be? If it's anywhere, it's in the box my father keeps under the floor panel in the back room, she said. He doesn't know I know about the box. He put it there when I was 12 and he didn't know I was watching. A pause. I've never opened it. It wasn't mine to open. And now, Nathaniel asked. Now it's mine to open, Elizabeth said, because it needs to be. She found it that evening. The box was cedar small, wrapped in oilcloth. Inside her grandfather's original land grant, the 1798 deed. A letter from the county surveyor 1803 confirming the corrected boundary lines after a previous dispute, and at the bottom folded separately in paper that had gone soft with age, a water rights notation, handwritten in the deed margin by the original land grant officer, dated 1776. The Carter property holds perpetual water access rights to the northern spring source and all associated drainage to the creek feeding east. These rights are not severable from the property itself and cannot be assigned, leased, or transferred without full property sale. Elizabeth sat on the floor of the back room with the document in her hands. Perpetual, not severable. Bennett could not acquire the water rights without acquiring Carter Farm entirely, which meant his entire 7-year acquisition arc, his 6 surrounding properties, his careful, patient hunting pattern. All of it depended on a document he either hadn't known about or had known about and hoped would never be found. She heard her father's footstep in the hall. The door opened. Thomas Carter looked at his daughter sitting on the floor with the cedar box open beside her. He looked at the document in her hands. He looked at her face. He said nothing for a long moment. "I should have told you," he said finally. "Yes," she agreed. "You should have. I thought—" He stopped. Started again. "I thought if I could keep it simple for you. Keep the fear simple. Not let it become what it's actually been." He moved to the doorway and leaned against it, and in the lamplight he looked very tired and very old, and also underneath both of those things, profoundly relieved. "I've been carrying it alone for too long." Elizabeth stood up. She crossed to her father and put the document in his hands. She did not embrace him. They were not demonstrative people. The Carters. They showed love through action rather than gesture, but she held the document out to him and waited until his hands closed around it. "You don't carry it alone anymore," she said. Thomas Carter looked down at the paper. His hands were shaking slightly, the afternoon tremor, the one he couldn't control. But his grip was steady. "The Whitmore boy," he said quietly. "He's a good man." "He's a complicated man," Elizabeth said. "But yes, I think he is." Her father nodded slowly. "His father was a good man too." He paused. "I wondered sometimes if he knew. If Robert Whitmore knew that the help he gave me that autumn, the knowledge about the limestone shelf, kept this place in the family." A pause. "Now I think he knew exactly." Elizabeth thought about a man who had ridden out of his way in 1802 to help a farmer he'd met on a road, because the farmer had once helped him with a lame horse. She thought about kindness that traveled forward through time without being announced. She thought about what it meant that his son was now sitting across her kitchen table 15 years later, answering questions about Charles Bennett and water rights and old debts. She thought nothing is coincidence, not this much coincidence. She took the document back from her father. "I need to show this to Nathaniel," she said. "I know," her father said. She was halfway down the hall when he spoke again. "Elizabeth." She turned. "Don't let his name make you cautious about him," Thomas Carter said. "The name is not the man." She looked at her father for a moment. This man she had organized her entire adult life around, protecting. And she thought about everything he had just told her, and everything he had borne alone, and the particular courage of a man who built something and held it and passed it forward. "I know the difference," she said. She went to write the message to Nathaniel. He came the next morning before 8 again. She met him at the gate and held out the document without preamble. He read it. She watched his face while he read the concentration, the small movement of his jaw when he got to the key phrase, the absolute stillness that followed. He looked up. "He doesn't have a path," Nathaniel said. "Not without the full property," Elizabeth agreed. "He may not know about this, or he may know and be hoping we don't," she said. "Either way, this is the line he cannot cross." Nathaniel folded the document very carefully and held it out. His expression was doing something she had not seen it do before, something that was not quite joy and not quite relief, but was the specific quality of a man whose estimation of a situation has just shifted entirely in a direction he had hoped for but hadn't quite let himself expect. "You found this yourself," he said. "I did." "Your father didn't—" "My father didn't know I was going to look," she said. "But he knew I would eventually. He'd been keeping it safe until someone was ready to use it." Nathaniel was quiet. "What do we do now?" Elizabeth asked. "We need someone in Staunton, a legitimate legal office, to file a formal water rights confirmation on this document. Something in county records that establishes its existence and its terms officially and publicly." He paused. "Once it's in the record, Bennett can't claim it was unknown to him. Any offer he makes after that point for any portion of this property becomes legally complicated for him." "He'll know immediately when it's filed," Elizabeth said. "Yes." "He'll know we know." "Yes." "And then?" she asked. "Then," Nathaniel said, "we find out what he does when the thing he's been hunting for 15 years turns around and faces him." Elizabeth took the document back and tucked it inside her coat. She thought about Charles Bennett, whom she had never met, who had been circling her family's land for 15 years with the patience of something that had never once considered that the farm might fight back. She thought about patience, about the kind that comes from entitlement, the kind that assumes it will eventually get what it wants because it always has. And she thought about the other kind, the kind that comes from necessity, from having no choice but to outlast the thing that is trying to take everything from you. She had been practicing that kind of patience since she was 16 years old. She was very good at it. "Schedule the filing," she said, "as soon as possible." Nathaniel nodded. He was looking at her with that expression again, that quality of recognition that she still didn't entirely know what to do with, that made her feel simultaneously seen and uncertain, which were two feelings she had rarely experienced at the same time. "Elizabeth," he said. "Don't say anything sentimental," she said. "Not yet. We have work to do." He pressed his lips together against something that was not quite a smile. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She walked back toward the house. Behind her, she heard him move, heard the deliberate, unhurried footstep of a man who had decided something and was not going to walk it back. She did not slow down. But she was aware, precisely inconveniently aware, that she had stopped somewhere in the past 2 weeks thinking about this situation only in terms of the farm, the document, and the threat. She had started thinking about it in terms of the man walking behind her. That was a problem she would have to address. Just not today. Today, there was a water rights document and a legal filing, and a man named Charles Bennett who was about to find out that Carter Farm had been waiting for him too. She pushed open the farmhouse door. The cedar box sat on the table where she'd left it. Her father looked up from his chair. "Well," he said. "We have what we need," Elizabeth said. Thomas Carter exhaled. It was the same exhale she'd heard from Nathaniel at the fence line, that long, slow release of something too long held. She thought, this is what justice sounds like before it arrives. Not thunder, not fanfare. Just a breath that has been waiting 15 years to be free. The filing took 3 days. Nathaniel rode to Staunton himself with the original water rights document wrapped in fresh oilcloth and tucked inside his coat, like something that needed protecting from the weather and from everything else. He brought his lawyer, not the Richmond man this time, but a local attorney named Prescott, who had practiced in Augusta County for 20 years and knew which clerk to approach and how to approach him, and crucially, how to make sure the filing landed in the permanent record rather than in the stack of documents that mysteriously took 6 weeks to process when certain interested parties preferred they did. Elizabeth had suggested Prescott. Nathaniel had said he didn't know the man. Elizabeth had said she did, and that he was honest, which in her experience was a rarer qualification than any degree or title, and that the grain merchant could vouch for him, and that the grain merchant's vouching meant something because the grain merchant was particular about who he trusted and had been burned enough times to have earned that particularity. Nathaniel had said all right. She had appreciated that. The absence of argument. The specific quality of a man who recognized when someone else's knowledge was better than his own, and simply used it without performance of reluctance. On the third morning, a message came back through the grain merchant. Filed and recorded. Augusta County Water Rights Registry, October 21, 1817. Document reference, 1817, WR 114. Prescott says, Bennett will know by week's end. Elizabeth read the message at the kitchen table while her father ate breakfast. She read it twice. Then she folded it and set it on the table and picked up her coffee cup and said nothing. Her father watched her. Good news. The kind that creates more work, she said. The best kind, he said. She almost smiled. Bennett knew by Thursday. She knew he knew because on Thursday afternoon, while she was at the east fence checking the repairs from the previous week, a rider came down the Carter lane at a pace that was not casual. He pulled up short when he saw her at the fence. He'd clearly expected to find no one in the yard, or expected to find a sick old man, or expected something other than Elizabeth Carter standing at a fence post with a mallet in her hand, looking at him without alarm. Howe was young, younger than she'd expected for a Bennett courier, maybe 20, with the look of someone who had been given a message to deliver and had been told it was important and was now reconsidering the confidence with which he'd ridden up. Miss Carter, he said. That's right, she said. I have a message from Mr. Charles Bennett. He requests a meeting at your earliest. "Tell Mr. Bennett," Elizabeth said, setting the mallet down on the fence rail in a deliberate way, "that I received his message, and that I will consider his request." She looked up at the writer. "That's all." The writer blinked. "He said it was urgent." "I imagine he did," she said. The writer looked at her for a moment longer, as though checking whether there was something more coming. There wasn't. Elizabeth had turned back to the fence post. He rode out. She listened to the hoofbeats, diminish down the lane, and then she stood very still for a moment, hands on the fence rail, and let herself feel the shape of what had just happened. Bennett had moved. Faster than she'd expected. She'd thought perhaps a week before he reached out, and it had been 4 days. That was good information. That was the information of a man who felt urgent, and urgency, in a man who had been patient for 15 years, meant something had rattled him. She went inside and wrote a message to Nathaniel. He made contact. Thursday afternoon. Requested a meeting. I did not agree or decline. I think you should be here when I respond. Nathaniel arrived Friday morning. He came in through the front gate, and Elizabeth was already outside, and she could see from 30 yards that he had something to tell her. There was a quality in the way he moved when he was carrying information, a slight forward lean, a focus in his attention that preceded speech. "Bennett went to Prescott's office yesterday," Nathaniel said before she could speak. "He went himself. Not a courier, he went personally. Prescott told me this morning." Elizabeth felt a cold adjustment run through her thinking. What did he want? He asked about the filing. He asked who had commissioned it. Prescott told him it was a routine property rights confirmation, and that he wasn't at liberty to discuss the commissioning party. Nathaniel paused. Bennett left without making a scene. But Prescott set his face when he saw the filing details. He said it was the face of a man who had just understood something he hadn't expected to understand. "He knows it's us," Elizabeth said. "He knows it's someone," Nathaniel said. "He may not be certain yet about me specifically, but he knows Carter Farm didn't file that document without help." Elizabeth considered this. "If he connects you to this, he'll try to find a way to pressure the connection," Nathaniel said. "Either through social leverage, my family name, my business relationships, making it inconvenient for me to be involved, or through something more direct." "What's more direct?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "He has a relationship with the county commissioner. I've known about it for some time. The commissioner oversees property dispute resolutions. If Bennett can frame the water rights filing as a disputed claim rather than a confirmation, he can trigger a review process that takes the question out of the standard record and into a more flexible process." Elizabeth understood what flexible meant. It meant a process where outcomes were more negotiable, more dependent on who knew whom and who owed what. "Can he do that?" she asked. "Legitimately." "He needs a basis for dispute," Nathaniel said. "A counterclaim. Something that suggests the 1776 notation is unclear or contested." He looked at her. "Has your family ever had any legal proceeding related to those water rights? Any document that might have created ambiguity, even unintentionally?" Elizabeth thought hard. "The 1802 meeting," she said slowly. "When Bennett first came to offer to buy the East Field, my father declined. But—" She stopped. "But what?" "My father said he almost signed," she said. "He said Bennett brought a document. He didn't sign it, but did it get recorded anywhere? A failed transaction." "A failed transaction leaves no record," Nathaniel said. "Unless Bennett filed something on his own side. A letter of intent. An offer document, something he submitted to county records as a preliminary to a sale that he claimed was in progress." They looked at each other. Elizabeth said very quietly, "We need to find out if he filed anything in 1802. She went to the county records office alone. Nathaniel had offered to come. She had told him no, and when he'd started to explain why he thought his presence might help, she'd said, "The clerk knows me. He's used to my being difficult. He is not used to you, and your name will either help too much or not at all, and I'd rather work with what I know." Nathaniel had closed his mouth. Then he'd said, "What do you need me to do?" and she had told him to find out through his own channels whether Bennett had any existing relationship with the county records office, specifically not just the commissioner, but the records staff. She'd walked to Staunton, 3 miles each way. She'd done it hundreds of times. Her feet knew the road. The clerk, a man named Gideon Ferris, who had been working the Augusta County Records Office since before Elizabeth was born, looked up when she walked in with the particular expression of a man who was recalibrating his morning plans. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Ferris," she said. "I need the 1802 property transaction filings for the north end of the county, specifically anything related to Carter Farm." Ferris cleared his throat. "That's a considerable—" "I can wait," she said. She sat down in the chair across from his desk. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at him with the absolute patience of a woman who had been doing this her entire adult life and had never once left without what she came for. Ferris went to get the records. He came back 20 minutes later with a box. He set it on the table and went back to his desk without a word. He knew by now that supervising Elizabeth Carter while she went through county records was neither useful nor comfortable. She went through the box methodically. 1802, North County, Carter Farm. She found it on the 4th folder. It was a letter of intent, filed November 1802. Filed by Charles Bennett's attorney, not by Bennett himself, filed in the name of a property company called Valley Land Interests, which she had never heard of. The document stated that Carter Farm had entered preliminary negotiations for the sale of a portion of the East Field, and that Valley Land Interests was recording its interest in the transaction as a pending buyer. Elizabeth read it 3 times. Her father had not signed anything, but Bennett or his attorney had filed a document creating the appearance that negotiations were underway, that a sale was being discussed, that there was at minimum an ambiguity about Carter Farm's intentions regarding the East Field. It was not a legal claim. But it was exactly the kind of document that in the hands of a cooperative commissioner could be used to suggest that the water rights question was embedded in a larger and more complicated history of transactions that required review. Elizabeth sat with that knowledge for exactly 60 seconds. Then she wrote down the document reference number, the filing date, the name of the attorney who had filed it, and the full name of Valley Land Interests. She took the paper to Ferris. "Mr. Ferris," she said, "Valley Land Interests. When did this company first appear in Augusta County records?" Ferris looked at the document number she'd written down. He was quiet for a moment. "That would take some time to research." "I have time," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. He went back to his records. Valley Land Interests appeared in Augusta County records for the first time in September 1802, 2 months before the Carter filing. Its registered agent was a man named Gerald Sims, attorney at law, Staunton. Its stated purpose was property acquisition and management in the Shenandoah Valley region. Its founding member, according to the original registration document, was listed simply as C. Bennett, Shenandoah Valley. Elizabeth had known it. Of course, she'd known it before she saw the document. But seeing it in the record, in the ink, in the formal language of a filing that had sat in that box for 15 years while her family didn't know it existed, that was different. That landed differently. She folded her notes and put them in her coat. She thanked Ferris, which surprised him. She didn't usually thank him. She just left when she had what she needed, and the departure itself was understood as courtesy enough. Then she walked back out to the street. And standing across the street watching her come out of the records office was a man she had never seen before. He was perhaps 55, well-dressed in the manner of a man who was used to being looked at and expected to be taken seriously on the basis of the looking. Heavy through the shoulders. A face that might once have been handsome and had instead become authoritative, which was the direction faces went when the person inside them had spent decades expecting compliance. He did not look away when she met his eyes. She did not look away either. They stood like that for perhaps 5 seconds, which is a very long time to hold someone's gaze across a street in Staunton, Virginia, in October of 1817. Then the man nodded, a single deliberate nod. Elizabeth did not nod back. She walked south toward home. Her heart was moving faster than she would have preferred. Not from fear. She understood the difference between fear and the physiological response to recognizing an enemy clearly for the first time. She was not afraid of Charles Bennett. But she was now certain in a way that documents alone could not make her certain that he was precisely as dangerous as everything she'd found suggested. He had been watching the records office. He had known she would come, which meant he already knew more than she had assumed. She sent for Nathaniel through the grain merchant at 2 in the afternoon. He was at the farm by 4, and she could tell he'd ridden fast because his horse was warm, and he didn't mention the ride at all, which was how she knew he'd been concerned. She told him everything. The 1802 filing, Valley land interests, the name on the registration, the man across the street. Nathaniel sat with it. He sat with it for longer than usual, not hesitating. She understood the difference between hesitation and processing. This was processing, and then he said, he was at the records office himself. Across the street, she said, watching. He knew you'd come today? Yes. How did he know you'd come today? Nathaniel said. Elizabeth stopped. It was the right question. The question she had been circling since she'd walked home and hadn't quite let herself land on. How did Bennett know she would go to the records office today? She hadn't told anyone except Nathaniel that she was going. She hadn't, the grain merchant, she said. Nathaniel looked at her. The messages, she said. I've been sending messages through the grain merchant. He's honest, I believe he's honest, but his shop is a crossroads. Anyone who passes through, anyone who conducts business there, anyone who spends enough time in the back room at the right moment, could hear enough to understand a pattern, Nathaniel finished. I'm not saying Jacob Mercer told Bennett anything deliberately, she said. I'm saying Bennett's people may have been watching the grain merchant for weeks, watching who comes and goes, watching what messages are carried. She pressed her lips together. I should have thought of that sooner. We should both have thought of it sooner, Nathaniel said. She looked at him sharply, because most men who said we in a sentence like that meant you, and she'd learned to hear the difference early. His face was level. He meant what he'd said. We need to stop sending messages through the merchant, she said. Agreed. He paused. Is there another way? There's a woman in Staunton, Elizabeth said. Martha Dill. She's been a friend of my mother's family since before I was born. She's lived on the same street for 30 years, and she knows everyone's business and tells none of it. If a message goes through Martha, it stays between the parties. Can she be trusted completely? She kept my mother's secrets for 20 years, Elizabeth said, including the ones my mother didn't know she'd told her. Nathaniel accepted this. The 1802 filing, he said, coming back to it. Bennett's attorney filed a letter of intent suggesting negotiations were underway on the East Field. That document has been sitting in county records for 15 years. Yes, and if he moves to dispute our water rights filing, he can point to that document as evidence of a history of transactions and attempted transactions involving Carter property that creates a pattern of what he'd call ambiguity around the property's overall legal status. That's what I believe he'll argue, Elizabeth said. Then we need to remove the document's credibility before he can use it, Nathaniel said. The simplest way to do that is to establish a counter-record, a formal statement from your father, attesting that he never entered negotiations with Valley land interests, never authorized anyone to represent Carter Farm in any transaction with that company, and never received or acknowledged any letter of intent. My father would have to make that statement in person, Elizabeth said, at the records office. Yes. She thought about her father, about his hands, about the 3-mile walk to Staunton, and what 3 miles of cold October road did to a man whose joints were what her father's joints were. He'll do it, she said. Don't concern yourself with whether he'll do it. He'll walk there on his hands if he has to. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment, with that expression, the one she'd never quite been able to categorize, and said, I know he will. I meant to ask whether we can make it easier on him. I have a carriage. Elizabeth blinked. It was such a straightforward, practical kindness. And she had been so locked in the logistics of the problem that she had not thought past the obstacle to the solution that was sitting right in front of her. Yes, she said. That would help. Monday, Nathaniel said. I'll bring the carriage at 7. Sunday evening, Elizabeth went to tell her father what was needed. She had spent the day going through every document in the cedar box again, slowly, carefully, not looking for new information this time, but making sure she completely understood what she already had. She'd also written out a timeline on a sheet of paper, every date, every filing, every transaction, every encounter. She wanted to see the shape of Bennett's plan laid out in sequence, because plans revealed their weaknesses in sequence, in a way they didn't when you looked at individual pieces. She'd found 3 weaknesses by the time she finished. The first, Valley land interests had been registered in Augusta County, but had never conducted a single completed transaction there. 15 years of filings and attempted acquisitions, and not one of them had closed. That was the record of a company that had been used for pressure and leverage, not genuine commerce. That pattern was visible in the record, and an honest attorney could make it visible to anyone. The second, the 1802 letter of intent, had been filed by an attorney, not by Carter Farm, or any Carter representative. Under Virginia property law, a letter of intent filed unilaterally by a buyer had no binding effect and created no legal obligation on the seller. Bennett's attorney had likely known this when he filed it. It had never been intended as a legal instrument. It had been filed as a record, as a piece of paper in a box that could be retrieved 15 years later to suggest a history that hadn't happened. The third weakness was the one that made her sit still for a long time when she found it. Valley land interests had been co-registered with a second name. She'd missed it on the first reading because it appeared on the back of the registration document in smaller script as a secondary founding member. The name was R. Holloway. She didn't know that name, but she knew how to find out what it meant. She folded the timeline paper and went to find her father. Thomas Carter was in his chair by the fire, which was where he spent his evenings now, and he looked up when Elizabeth came in with the expression of a man who had been waiting not impatiently, but with the readiness of someone who knows a conversation is coming and has been preparing for it. She sat down across from him and told him everything. The records office, the 1802 filing, Bennett across the street, what needed to happen on Monday. All of it. Her father listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I knew about the letter of intent," he said. Elizabeth went very still. "Bennett told me about it himself," her father said. "He came back in 1803, a few months after his attorney had filed it. He told me as a kind of warning. He said there was a document in county records that might create complications for Carter Farm in any future property matters if I didn't cooperate with his proposals." Thomas Carter's voice was steady, level. The voice of a man who had held this for a long time and had decided how to hold it. It was a threat. He was telling me that he had put something in the public record that could be used against us. He was telling me that the simplest way to make it go away was to sell him what he wanted. Elizabeth said nothing. "I didn't sell him anything," her father said. "And I didn't tell anyone about the document, because telling someone meant explaining the whole situation, and explaining the whole situation meant showing how close we had come to losing everything in 1802. Meant admitting that a man had been able to threaten us, and that I had no immediate recourse." He paused. "I was ashamed. That is the simplest explanation, and I believe you deserve the simple one." "Papa," Elizabeth said. "I thought I could outlast him," Thomas Carter said. "I thought if I held the farm long enough, if we held it together eventually, he'd find another way, or give up, or—" He stopped. "I was wrong. Not about holding the farm, about thinking I could do it alone." Elizabeth looked at her father. She thought about 16 years of managing this land. 16 years of county clerks and grain merchants and fence posts and flood fields. 16 years of doing what needed doing without naming the size of it, because naming the size of it made it harder to carry. She thought, we are the same, he and I. We hold things alone until we can't, and then we are surprised it was so heavy. "You're not alone now," she said. "No," he agreed. "I'm not." She told him about R. Holloway. The name hit her father like cold water, not violently, but with the abrupt shock of something that cuts through inattention. "Holloway," he said. "You know it." "Richard Holloway," her father said slowly. He was on the county commission, 15-20 years ago, before my time dealing with county matters much." He paused. "He died in 1808 or 1809. Left a family. A son, I believe." "Bennett co-registered his company with a county commissioner," Elizabeth said. "With a former commissioner," her father said. "But yes, that's what it means." "Then the connection to the current commissioner isn't new," Elizabeth said. "He's been building relationships inside the county administrative structure for 20 years. This is not opportunism. This is a system." Her father looked at her with an expression that was grief and pride in equal painful measure. "You should have known all of this years ago," he said. "I know it now," she said. "That's enough." Tall. Monday morning came cold and clear. Nathaniel's carriage arrived at 7 exactly as he'd said. Elizabeth helped her father into it. Thomas Carter moved with the careful dignity of a man who did not intend to let his body's limitations define the terms of his presence in the world, and they rode to Staunton together, the three of them, in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but was full of the particular weight of people traveling toward something they could not take back once it was done. Prescott met them at the records office. He had the statement drafted already. Elizabeth had sent him a message through Martha Dill on Sunday evening, and Martha had delivered it that same night with the efficiency of a woman who had spent 30 years understanding that certain messages could not wait until morning. The statement was precise and legally clean. Thomas Carter of Carter Farm, Augusta County, Virginia, attested under his signature that he had never entered negotiations with Valley Land Interests, had never authorized any representative to negotiate on Carter Farm's behalf with that company, and had received the 1802 letter of intent as an unsolicited and unauthorized filing, which he had explicitly rejected. Ferris processed it without conversation. He was careful not to meet anyone's eyes, which Elizabeth noted as the behavior of a man who understood something about the context he was operating in, and had decided that neutrality was his safest posture. When the filing was complete, Prescott handed Thomas Carter the counter reference number. Thomas Carter put it in his pocket. He shook Prescott's hand. He turned to leave, and Charles Bennett walked through the door. I was alone. No attorney, no aide, no courier. Just the man himself in a coat that cost more than most farmers in the county made in a quarter, with the face she'd seen across the street on Thursday, the face of a man who expected to be taken seriously. He looked at Elizabeth first, then at Thomas Carter, then at Nathaniel. The calculation happened visibly. Not in a theatrical way, not dramatically, but in the specific way of an intelligent man, rapidly revising his understanding of a situation. His eyes moved, his jaw adjusted. Something behind his eyes shifted, and not in a direction that suggested retreat. "Mr. Carter," he said. "Mr. Bennett," her father said. "It seems we've been busy in the records office," Bennett said pleasantly. "People with property tend to be," Thomas Carter said. Bennett looked at Elizabeth. "Miss Carter," he said, "I don't believe we've been formally introduced." "I know who you are," Elizabeth said. He almost smiled. "I imagine you do." He looked at Nathaniel. "Whitmore." "Bennett," Nathaniel said. Pleasantries exchanged. 3 names, 3 acknowledgments. The social surface of something underneath which all 3 parties were measuring distance and force. "I'd hoped," Bennett said still pleasantly, "that we might have been able to have a conversation before things progressed to the records office stage." "We received your request for a meeting," Elizabeth said. "We're having that meeting now." Bennett looked at her a long, assessing look, the look of a man recalibrating what kind of obstacle he was dealing with. "I see," he said. "The 1802 filing has been addressed," Elizabeth continued. "The water rights confirmation stands. Carter Farm has no interest in any transaction with Valley Land Interests, has never had such an interest, and the county record now reflects that clearly." She paused. "If you have a legal basis for a counterclaim, you're welcome to make it. The record is comprehensive." Bennett's pleasant expression had gone somewhere else during this speech. Not to anger, he was too controlled for visible anger, to a kind of cold reassessment. "You've done your research," he said. "I always do," she said. He looked at all 3 of them again, the calculation visible again. Then he said to Nathaniel, "Your father would be surprised by the company you've chosen to keep." There was a silence. Then Nathaniel said very quietly, "My father would be proud of the company I've chosen to keep." He knew Thomas Carter. He thought he was one of the finest men in the valley, and he was not wrong. Bennett looked at Nathaniel for a moment. Then he looked at Elizabeth, and something happened in his face, a small, precise movement, almost imperceptible. Not a concession, not a surrender, but something. The recognition maybe that the thing he was facing was not what he had planned for, that the calculation had variables he hadn't accounted for. He put his hat on. "Good day," he said. He walked out. The door closed behind him. Elizabeth stood in the records office with her father and Nathaniel and Prescott in the specific silence that follows something that is not finished but has changed shape entirely. Her heart was still moving fast. She made herself breathe. "He'll try again," Prescott said quietly from behind his desk. "I know," Elizabeth said. "What do you want to do?" She looked at the door through which Charles Bennett had just walked. She thought about his face, not the pleasantness, not the calculation, but the moment beneath them. Both. The moment when he'd said your father would be surprised, and she had heard in those words not a threat, but a probe. He had been testing Nathaniel, testing the connection, trying to find a crack where he could insert something doubt obligation social pressure that would separate the pieces of what had just assembled itself in the Augusta County Records Office. He hadn't found a crack, but he was going to look harder. "He said something about your father," Elizabeth said to Nathaniel when they were outside, and her father was being helped into the carriage. "I heard it," Nathaniel said. "He said your father would be surprised," she said. "He didn't say displeased. He said surprised." "Why surprised?" Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she turned to look at him. His face had changed. The steadiness was still there, the quality she'd come to recognize as foundational to him, but underneath it something had shifted. Not cracked, shifted. "There is something," he said, "about my father and your father and the history between them that I have not told you." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "I've known since Saturday when you said he was not wrong with a tone that wasn't past tense." She paused. "Tell me." Nathaniel glanced at the carriage where Thomas Carter was settled and waiting. "Not here," he said. "Not in front of him, not yet. There are things he doesn't know yet, and I need to find the right way." "Tonight," she said. It was not a request. "Tonight," he agreed. She climbed into the carriage. Her father looked at her, and she could see from his face that he had heard enough, not all of it, but the shape of it to understand that the day was not over. That the conversation with Bennett had been the visible thing, and that the real thing, the deeper thing, was still approaching. Thomas Carter reached out and put his hand over hers. His hands were shaking. She turned her hand over and held his. She thought, "We have held this land through drought and flood, and a man who has spent 15 years trying to take it. We will hold it through whatever is coming tonight." The carriage moved forward. Nathaniel rode alongside. None of them spoke. The road back to Carter Farm ran south. The same road where a wheel had broken 3 weeks ago in the rain and in the cold morning light. It looked different than it had that evening. More ordinary. More like what it actually was, just a road. Just dirt and distance. Just the ordinary ground on which extraordinary things sometimes happened to people who were paying attention. Elizabeth looked at it and thought, "I am paying attention. I have always been paying attention." Whatever is coming, she was ready. Nathaniel came that evening at 7. He came on foot, which surprised her. The Whitmore property was 4 miles east, and he had a perfectly good horse, and yet he walked, which told her something she filed away without comment. A man who walks 4 miles to a difficult conversation is a man who spent those 4 miles deciding exactly what he was going to say and how he was going to say it. He wasn't nervous. He was prepared. There was a difference, and she had learned to read it. She met him at the door before he knocked. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Come in," she said. Her father was at the table. Thomas Carter had not gone to bed, which Elizabeth had expected, and had not argued with, because some conversations required witnesses, and her father understood that better than most men she had ever known. Nathaniel sat down. He did not take off his coat immediately, which meant part of him was still deciding how long he would need to stay. Then he took it off. Set it over the chair. That meant he had decided he would stay as long as it took. Elizabeth sat across from him. Her father sat at the end of the table between them, like a man who intended to hear everything and make his own accounting of it. "Tell me," Elizabeth said. Nathaniel put both hands flat on the table, a gesture she had not seen from him before, the gesture of a man placing everything visible and open. "My father came to this farm in 1802, he said. You know that. He came because Thomas Carter helped him on the road, and he felt the debt. He looked at the land he told your father about the limestone shelf, and he left." He paused. "What he didn't tell your father, what he didn't tell anyone, because he believed some gifts were diminished by announcement, was that he did something else before he left Staunton that autumn." Elizabeth said nothing, waiting. "He went to the grain merchant," Nathaniel said. "The one your family used at the time, a man named Porter, who retired in 1810. My father paid off your family's outstanding debt to Porter's ledger, in full, anonymously. He told Porter it was a commercial adjustment and asked him to carry the balance forward as settled and to say nothing about the source." The kitchen was very quiet. Thomas Carter made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a breath. Something in between. "The debt I thought I'd paid down by spring of 1803, her father said slowly. "I thought we'd had a better quarter than I expected." "You had the same quarter you expected," Nathaniel said. "My father made up the difference, approximately $47. He looked at Thomas Carter directly. "He told me about it the year before he died. He said it was the thing he was most glad he'd done quietly, because if he'd done it loudly, you might not have accepted it, and the farm needed it." Elizabeth watched her father's face. Thomas Carter was not a man who showed emotion easily. He showed it the way old wood shows weather, in the grain, in the texture, in things that were visible if you knew how to look. What was happening in his face now was visible even to someone who didn't know how to look. It was the face of a man receiving a kindness 15 years after it was given, which was both more and less than receiving it at the time. "He never said a word," Thomas Carter said. "He didn't want to," Nathaniel said. "He said a kindness that requires acknowledgement is a transaction. He didn't want a transaction." Her father pressed his hand flat on the table, steadying himself. "Why are you telling me now?" "Because Bennett knows," Nathaniel said. The temperature in the room changed. Elizabeth sat forward. "What does he know?" "He knows my father paid the debt," Nathaniel said. "I don't know how. I don't know if someone talked, if there was a record somewhere, if Porter said something before he died. But when Bennett came to me 6 months ago with his water rights proposition, he said something I didn't fully understand at the time." He paused. "He said the Whitmore family has a long history of interference in Carter farm matters. I would think carefully about continuing that pattern." "I was warning you off," Elizabeth said. "He was telling me he knew," Nathaniel said, "and he was using it as leverage, suggesting that my family's involvement in Carter affairs was a pattern of overreach, he'd imply, of a wealthy family manipulating a poorer one. He would use it to frame whatever I did to help you as self-interested interference rather than legitimate assistance." Elizabeth understood immediately. He'd tell the county commissioner that the water rights filing was orchestrated by the Whitmore family for their own property interests. That Carter farm was being used as a proxy. "It would undermine the filing's credibility," Nathaniel said. "And it would undermine yours." "And it would separate us," Elizabeth said. The word "us" landed on the table between them with a weight neither of them acknowledged directly, but both of them felt. "Yes," Nathaniel said. Thomas Carter had been listening with his eyes half closed, which was how he listened when he was thinking hardest. He opened them now. "You knew all of this," he said to Nathaniel. "When you first came here, you knew Bennett had this information about your father." "I suspected he had something," Nathaniel said. "I knew about the debt payment my father told me. I didn't know whether Bennett had uncovered it. When he made that comment about a long history of interference, I became fairly certain he had." He paused. "I should have told you sooner. I told myself I needed to understand the full picture first. But the honest answer is—" He stopped, started again. "The honest answer is that I wasn't sure how it would land. Whether you would think I came here because of the debt. Whether it would change how you saw my reasons for being here. I was looking at Elizabeth when he said it. She held his gaze. Did you come here because of the debt? She asked. No, he said. I came here because a wheel broke on a rainy road and a woman appeared out of nowhere and fixed it and spoke to me like I was a person rather than a name. That is the complete and honest accounting of why I came. Elizabeth said nothing for a moment. But you knew, she said. When I told you I was Elizabeth Carter from Carter Farm, you knew who we were. I put it together, yes, he said. My father had mentioned the name. I knew the farm. I knew the connection. And you didn't say so. No, he said. I didn't. She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that he didn't fill the silence with justification, which she respected, even as she was sorting through what she felt about all of it. She felt complicated things. She felt the particular frustration of a woman who had spent her life demanding honesty and discovering that the people she was beginning to trust had held pieces of the truth back, not maliciously, not with intent to harm, but with the very human logic of people who were trying to protect something fragile and had misjudged when to let it breathe. She felt that, and she held it, and she also held the other thing. The thing that was harder to be angry about. He had come back. 3 times on foot in the last case 4 miles each way to sit at her table and answer questions, and hold fence posts, and look at county records, and do every practical and difficult thing that had needed doing. He had not come to perform. He had come to help. She knew the difference. You should have told me sooner, she said. Yes, he said. I should have. I don't like surprises. I know that now, he said. I knew it before I came tonight. Then why did you wait this long? He was quiet for a moment. Because telling you meant telling you that my family has been involved in your family's life for 15 years without your knowledge. And I didn't know, I still don't entirely know whether that feels like grace to you or like something else. Elizabeth looked at her father. Thomas Carter was looking at his hands. Papa, she said. He raised his eyes. How does it feel? She asked. I thought about it. Really thought about it. She could see it, the slow internal accounting of a man running the weight of something through his full attention before he answered. It feels, Thomas Carter said carefully, like I have been looked after by people I didn't know were looking, and that I would have refused if I'd known, and that I was wrong to think refusal was the right instinct. He paused. It feels like being forgiven a debt I didn't know someone had already paid. The room was very still. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. What do we do about Bennett? Elizabeth said. Because she was the one who always came back to what needed doing, and it needed doing now. He's going to use the history, Nathaniel said. My father's payment, the pattern of Whitmore involvement in Carter affairs. He'll take it to the commissioner. He'll frame the water rights filing as a manufactured document serving Whitmore interests, and he'll use that framing to demand a review. Can he win a review? Elizabeth asked. Not on the legal merits, Nathaniel said. The water rights notation is genuine. The 1776 document is genuine. Prescott is confident about that. He paused. But a review process isn't always about legal merits. It's about who shows up, who speaks, who the commissioner is more inclined to believe when the facts are genuinely contested, and who has more to gain from a particular outcome. Then we need people who will show up, Elizabeth said. Yes. Who do we have? Nathaniel considered. Prescott. He'll testify to the document's legitimacy and to the filing process. He paused. I have 2 neighboring landowners on my eastern section who have seen Bennett operate and don't like what they've seen. They might speak. The Johnsons, Elizabeth said. Our nearest neighbors. They've had their own dealings with land surveyors in the North County. If Bennett's pattern has touched them, and I believe it has, they have reason to speak. She thought. And Mrs. Halloran. Nathaniel looked up. The estate sale. The bankruptcy that shouldn't have happened, Elizabeth said. If someone helped that family understand what was done to them, if there's a case that their financial collapse was not natural, they have more than reason to speak. They have something to recover. Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression. Respect, but not the kind that was surprised, the kind that recognized something it had already known was there. "You've already been thinking about this," he said. "I've been thinking about it since I found the county records pattern," she said. "Bennett has been doing this long enough that he's left people behind him. People who lost things they shouldn't have lost. Those people are not his strength, they're his exposure." She went to see Mrs. Halloran the next morning, alone because some conversations were damaged by the presence of a Whitmore name, and she understood that, and she went to the Halloran place, a smaller farm now than it had been, sold down from its original acreage to cover debts that Eliza Halloran had never quite understood, and knocked on the door. Eliza Halloran was 50, sharp-eyed, and had the specific wariness of a woman who had been approached by enough people offering help that had turned into complications. She looked at Elizabeth for a long moment before she stepped aside to let her in. Elizabeth told her what she'd found in the records. All of it. The Valley Land Interests registration. The pattern of acquisitions. The Halloran bankruptcy filed in the same year that Valley Land Interests had approached them twice with offers on their water access. Mrs. Halloran listened without speaking. When Elizabeth finished, the older woman was quiet for a long time. "I always thought it was bad luck," she said finally. Her voice was flat, not without feeling but controlled in the way of a person who has processed grief until it has become something manageable. Edward thought it was bad luck too. He blamed himself for the planting decisions, for the credit line, for all of it. He died blaming himself. "It wasn't bad luck," Elizabeth said. "And it wasn't his fault." Mrs. Halloran looked at her. "Can you prove it?" "Not all of it," Elizabeth said honestly. "Not enough for a criminal proceeding, but enough to show a pattern. Enough to show that Valley Land Interests appeared in the county, approached multiple families, and that those families experienced financial difficulties in the period immediately following the approach." She paused. "That pattern in front of a county review board has weight." "Will it give me back my land?" Mrs. Halloran asked. Elizabeth held her gaze. "No," she said. "I can't promise you that. The completed transactions are completed. I won't lie to you about what this can recover." Mrs. Halloran studied her. "Then why should I speak?" "Because your husband blamed himself until he died," Elizabeth said. "And he was wrong, and the man who made him wrong is still doing it to other people." She paused. "I can't give you your land back, but I can make sure the record knows the truth about how you lost it, and I can make sure he doesn't do to another family what he did to yours." The silence stretched. Then Eliza Halloran said, "When do you need me?" The review was called for the second week of November. Bennett had moved faster than Elizabeth had expected, which updated her thinking about how threatened he felt by the water rights filing. He had gone to the commissioner within 48 hours of the records office encounter and filed a formal challenge citing the Whitmore family's history of involvement in Carter farm affairs as evidence of a coordinated and self-interested effort to manipulate county land records. Commissioner Harold Vance was 60 years old, had held his position for 11 years, and had Elizabeth confirmed through Martha Dill, who knew the commissioner's housekeeper, personally accepted 3 separate social invitations from Charles Bennett in the previous 2 years. Dinners. A hunting trip. The specific calendar of a man who was being cultivated. This was not a friendly venue. Elizabeth knew it. Nathaniel knew it. Prescott knew it. They prepared anyway. The week before the review, Elizabeth went back to Staunton 3 times. She met with Prescott twice. She sat with the Johnsons, the neighboring family, for 2 hours on a Thursday evening, going through everything they had experienced with North County land surveyors over the past decade, pulling out the threads that connected to Valley Land Interests, building the picture piece by piece. She wrote everything down in her clear, precise hand and gave Prescott copies of everything. She went to see Martha Dill not for messages this time, but for something else. "You know everyone in this town," Elizabeth said. "You have for 30 years." "I do," Martha said. "Commissioner Vance," Elizabeth said. "Not his connections to Bennett. His other connections. His honest connections. The people he answers to when he's being honest." Martha Dill looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled, not warmly exactly, but with the satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting for someone to ask the right question. His wife's family are the Morgans, she said. Old Augusta County family. The Morgan patriarch built this county's first proper grain storage. His granddaughter married Vance 20 years ago. The Morgans have never liked Bennett. They had a boundary dispute with one of his North County acquisitions in 1810 that went badly. She paused. The commissioner listens to his wife, and his wife listens to her father. Could I speak to Morgan? Elizabeth asked. He's 81, Martha said. But he's sharp, and he holds grudges the way farmers hold land permanently and with full knowledge of the deed. She paused. I'll send him a message tonight. She met Robert Morgan on a Friday morning at his daughter's house on the east end of Staunton. He was indeed 81, and he was indeed sharp, and he looked at Elizabeth Carter, the way very old men sometimes looked at young women who came to see them about business, with the initial assessment of someone cataloging an anomaly, followed by the recalibration of someone who was finding the anomaly more interesting than expected. "You're Thomas Carter's daughter," he said. "I am," she said. "I knew your grandfather," he said. "Solid man, honest." "Yes, sir," she said. "He was." "Sit down," Morgan said. "Tell me what Bennett has done." She told him. All of it. Every document, every date, every filing. She'd arranged it in her notes, not dramatically, not with persuasion in her voice, because Robert Morgan was not a man who responded to persuasion. He responded to information delivered straight. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "You have documentation of all of this." "Copies of every county record, yes, sir," she said. "Prescott has the full set." Morgan was quiet. "My daughter married Harold Vance," he said. "I am not going to pretend I don't know what you're implying about the commissioner's relationship with Bennett." "I'm not implying anything, sir," Elizabeth said. "I'm describing what the county record shows and what we believe will happen in a review process. What you make of that is your own judgment." Morgan looked at her for a long moment. "You're more careful than I expected," he said. "I've had to be," she said. I made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been simply agreement. "I'll speak to my son-in-law," he said. "I cannot tell you what he'll do, but I can tell you that Harold Vance knows who his people are, and he knows who Bennett is not. And some things, when they're placed in front of a man clearly enough, are difficult to look away from." Elizabeth nodded once. She thanked him and left. The review was held in the Augusta County Administrative Building on a Tuesday morning in the second week of November. It was not a public proceeding. County reviews rarely were, but it was witnessed in the way that formal proceedings were witnessed. Prescott for Elizabeth and Thomas Carter, an attorney named Graves for Charles Bennett, Commissioner Vance at the head of the table, a county recorder in the corner with pen and paper. Elizabeth had not expected to be present. County reviews did not typically include the property owners themselves. They were conducted through attorneys. But Prescott had negotiated for her and Thomas Carter to be seated, citing the complexity of the historical documentation and the need for the record holders to be available for direct questions. Bennett had objected. Vance had overruled him. That was the first indication. She sat beside Prescott and across from Bennett, and she looked at Charles Bennett directly for the first time with the space and the time to do it properly. He looked back at her. The pleasantness was still there, technically the surface of it, but something underneath it had changed since the records office. He had recalibrated. He was looking at her the way you looked at a problem that was larger than you'd initially estimated. Good, she thought. Vance opened the proceedings and stated the matter under review, whether the October water rights filing for Carter Farm was a valid confirmation of pre-existing rights or a new claim manufactured for adversarial purposes. Bennett's attorney went first. Graves was smooth and methodical. He laid out the Whitmore family's history of involvement in Carter Farm affairs, the 1802 debt payment, the multiple visits by Nathaniel Whitmore. In recent weeks, the commissioning of a water rights filing that he argued served Whitmore property interests by securing the Carter Spring source against any competing access claims that might affect water flow to the Whitmore eastern section. He argued that the filing was not a confirmation, but a strategic move by a wealthy family using a smaller farm as a legal instrument. It was well argued. Elizabeth gave him that. Then Prescott went. He presented the 1776 notation. He presented the original land grant. He walked through the legal definition of perpetual and non-severable water rights under Virginia property law. He presented Thomas Carter's counterstatement regarding the 1802 letter of intent. He presented the pattern of Valley Land Interests acquisitions across 6 properties. He presented Mrs. Halloran's written statement. He presented the Johnson family's account of land survey irregularities in the North County. Then he said, "We also note for the record that Valley Land Interests was co-registered with a member of the County Commission who held office during the period of the company's initial acquisitions. We are not making an allegation regarding this commissioner. We are noting it as part of the full record of Valley Land Interests' operating history in Augusta County." The room was very quiet. Vance had not moved. Bennett, for the first time in Elizabeth's experience of him, was not wearing any particular expression. Graves leaned toward his client and said something quietly. Bennett said nothing back. Vance looked at the documents in front of him for a long time. Then he looked up. "The 1776 notation," he said to Prescott. "You've had this examined by a second legal authority beyond your own office, by Robert Halloran of the Richmond Bar. Yes, Commissioner," Prescott said. "His written assessment is in the record package. He concurs that the language is unambiguous." Vance nodded, slowly. He was an intelligent man, Elizabeth could see, that had suspected it even before Morgan's characterization of him. He was a man who had been cultivated and had allowed himself to be cultivated, and was now sitting with the particular discomfort of someone who understands that they are in a room where the full accounting is visible to everyone present. "Mr. Bennett," Vance said. Bennett looked at him. "Do you have documentary evidence that the 1776 notation is invalid or fraudulent?" A pause. "My attorney has noted the circumstances of the filing." "Documentary evidence," Vance repeated, "that the document itself is invalid." Another pause. "No," Bennett said. Vance looked at his recorder. "Note that the challenging party has provided no documentary evidence contesting the validity of the original water rights notation." He closed the folder in front of him. "The challenge to the October filing is dismissed. The water rights confirmation for Carter Farm stands as recorded." He stood up. The proceeding was over. Elizabeth sat very still for a moment. Then she picked up her gloves from the table and put them on one at a time and stood up. Bennett was still in his chair. His attorney was saying something to him in a low, practical voice, probably already talking about what came next, because men like Bennett always had a what came next. He would not stop entirely. She knew that. She had never expected him to stop entirely. But he would have to stop here. He would have to go around Carter Farm, because Carter Farm would not move. She walked toward the door. Behind her she heard Bennett say, not to anyone in particular, just into the room, "Miss Carter." She stopped. She turned. He was looking at her from his chair. Not with pleasantness this time, not with the calculation she'd seen on the records office street. He was looking at her with something that was closer to honesty than anything she had seen on his face before. Not warmth, not concession, just a kind of stark recognition. "You are not what I expected," he said. Elizabeth looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "I rarely am." She walked out. Nathaniel was waiting on the street outside. He had not been permitted in the proceeding. He had known he would not be permitted, and had not argued it, because he understood that his presence was the central argument Bennett was making, and that removing that presence from the room was the correct tactical decision, even if it was a personally difficult one. Howe was standing very still when she came out. He looked at her face, and something in him released. She could see it. The specific softening of a person who has been holding against a possible bad outcome and has just been told it's safe to let go. "Well," he said. "It stands," she said. He exhaled. "Bennett has nothing?" he asked. "Bennett has nothing on this," she said. "He'll find another approach eventually. But not this one." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father." "Still inside with Prescott," she said. "He'll be out in a few minutes." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with that expression, the one she had never been able to entirely categorize, and had stopped trying to categorize weeks ago, because she had begun to understand that some things didn't need a category, They just needed to be allowed to be what they were. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for not telling you about my father's involvement sooner, for giving Bennett the opportunity to try to use it." "You also saved us from having Bennett use something we didn't know about," she said, "because once we knew, we could put it in the record ourselves, on our terms." He looked slightly surprised. Not the surprise of a man who hadn't considered it, the surprise of a man who had considered it and hadn't expected her to see it the same way. "You're more generous than I deserve," he said. "I'm precise," she said. "I don't give more than is accurate, and I don't give less." She paused. "You have behaved in the balance like a man who wanted to help and made some human errors in the process. That is the accurate accounting." He was quiet. The door behind her opened, and Thomas Carter came out, moving slowly, Prescott at his elbow. Her father's face was tired, but settled the specific quality of exhaustion that comes after something has been carried and finally set down. He looked at Nathaniel. "Thank you," Thomas Carter said, "for what your father did, and for what you've done." He paused. "I would have refused the money in 1802 if I'd known." "I know," Nathaniel said. "I'm glad I didn't get the chance," Thomas Carter said. "I'm glad Robert Whitmore knew me well enough to know that." He extended his hand. Nathaniel took it. They held the handshake for a moment longer than a formal handshake required, the specific grip of two people acknowledging something that had no other good form of acknowledgement. Elizabeth watched them. She thought about a lame horse on a road in 1802 and a broken wheel in 1817, and the long invisible thread that ran between those two moments, connecting her family to this man's family across 15 years and 3 generations of stubbornness and silence and careful, quiet help. She thought the world is smaller than it looks, and kindness travels further than you expect, and some debts are not debts at all. They are just the shape that grace takes when it moves through time. Her father was looking at her now. "Let's go home," he said. She nodded, but she looked at Nathaniel first. He was still watching her. He would not say yet what he was going to say. She knew that had known for a while that there was something he was waiting for the right moment to say, and that he would wait for it with the same patience he'd applied to everything else. He was not a man who rushed the things that mattered. She found somewhat to her own surprise that she was willing to wait too. "Come for supper on Thursday," she said. The corners of his mouth moved. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She helped her father to the carriage. The 3 of them rode home through the November cold, and the land on either side of the road was bare and brown and entirely unapologetically itself. Not beautiful in any decorative sense, just real, just present, just the honest ground of a valley that had outlasted everything anyone had tried to do to it. Carter Farm appeared in the distance. Elizabeth looked at it. 12 acres. Good soil on the east side. The west field still flooded in heavy rain years, and that was not going to change, and she had made her peace with it. It was enough. It had always been enough. It was theirs. Thursday supper came and went, and then the following Thursday, and then the one after that. Nobody made a formal arrangement of it. Nobody said this is now a regular thing, or you are expected here on Thursdays. It simply happened the way certain things happen between certain people, quietly and without announcement, until it has been happening long enough that its absence would be the thing requiring explanation. Nathaniel came on Thursdays. He brought things, sometimes a cut of meat from the Whitmore smokehouse, a bag of the grain he'd been testing on the eastern section, once a small jar of honey from a neighbor's hives that he mentioned with such deliberate casualness that Elizabeth understood immediately he had gone out of his way to acquire it and did not want her to make anything of that. She did not make anything of it. She put the honey on the table, and her father spread some on his bread and said it was very good, and that was the end of it. They ate. They talked. Thomas Carter and Nathaniel talked about grain varieties and drainage and the state of the tobacco market, with the ease of men who had discovered they thought about the world in compatible ways. Elizabeth listened and contributed and sometimes disagreed with both of them, and was never once told her disagreement was unwelcome. That was the thing she kept noticing. The absence of the thing she had spent her life bracing for, the moment when a man decided her opinions were interesting up to a point, and that point had now been reached. Nathaniel did not have that point. Or if he did, she had not found it yet, and she had been looking because she was not a woman who stopped looking just because the immediate evidence was favorable. But November became December, and December settled cold over the valley, and still she had not found it. She began to think quietly and without drama that it might not exist. The letter from Bennett arrived on a Monday in the second week of December. It came through his attorney addressed to Prescott, and Prescott sent a copy to the farm the same day with a brief note. "Read this carefully. I don't think it's what it appears to be." Elizabeth read it at the kitchen table, while her father looked at her face to understand what she was reading. The letter was on its surface a formal withdrawal. Bennett's attorney informed Prescott that Valley Land Interests was withdrawing all outstanding propositions related to Carter Farm property and water rights, that they acknowledged the October filing as valid and binding, and that they anticipated no further legal proceedings regarding the matter. A clean withdrawal, a concession on paper. Elizabeth read it twice and then set it down. "He's withdrawing," her father said. "On paper," she said. "You don't believe it." "I believe the words," she said. "I don't believe that's the end of the intention." She sent a message to Nathaniel through Martha Dill. He arrived the next morning. He read the letter standing up, which she had noticed was how he read things when he was processing fast. He didn't sit because sitting was for when you had time. "This is Graves' language," he said. "His attorney, not Bennett." "I noticed that," she said. "Bennett doesn't issue withdrawals through his attorney unless he's been told to," Nathaniel said. "He operates directly when he's choosing to operate. This is—" He stopped. "Someone told him to stop," Elizabeth finished. "Someone with enough standing to make it worth his while to listen," Nathaniel said. They looked at each other. "Morgan," Elizabeth said. "Or Vance himself," Nathaniel said. After the review, a commissioner who has just been made publicly aware that a man he's accepted hospitality from was co-registered with a former commissioner. That commissioner has motivation to create some distance, quietly, formally, in a way that leaves a paper trail of non-involvement. Elizabeth thought about this. About the machinery of it, the way powerful men communicated pressure without ever touching anything directly. The way a dinner conversation could result in a letter from an attorney 3 weeks later that contained no fingerprints and solved everyone's problem simultaneously. "Is it over?" her father asked. He had come to the doorway and was listening. Elizabeth looked at the letter again. "For now," she said. "For this approach. But not permanently," Thomas Carter said. "Men like Bennett don't stop permanently," Nathaniel said with the plain honesty of someone who had been watching that particular type of man his entire life. "They redirect. They find a different angle, a different approach, a different moment. But—" He paused. "The water rights are on record permanently. The counterstatement is on record. The pattern of Valley Land Interests activities is on record. The next approach, whenever it comes, starts from a position that is considerably worse for him than the one he started from this year." Thomas Carter nodded slowly. "Then we've done what we can do." "For now," Elizabeth said again. She folded the letter. "Put it in the cedar box with everything else. Let it take its place in the history of Carter Farm, not as a triumph, not as a final word, but as one chapter of a long story about a piece of land and the people who refused to let go of it." Christmas came without ceremony. The Carters did not celebrate extravagantly. They had not had the means for extravagance in many years and had long since made their peace with simplicity. But Elizabeth made a pie from the last of the autumn apples, and her father read aloud from the Bible the way he had done every Christmas Eve since she could remember, and it was enough. Nathaniel sent a note on Christmas morning through Martha, wishing the Carter family well. He did not come. Elizabeth had not expected him to come. Christmas was for families, and they were not yet. She made herself say it directly in her own thinking because she had no patience for euphemism. Even inside her own head, they were not yet family. But the note was carefully written. Not formally, not with the distance of a seasonal courtesy. It was a note from a man who was thinking about the people he was writing to and wanted them to know it without being theatrical about the wanting. She kept it. She put it in her coat pocket, not in the cedar box, which was where she kept documents and records and things that needed to be preserved. Her coat pocket was where she kept things she needed to have near her. She noticed she had done this and did not examine it further. January was hard. Thomas Carter's hands got worse in January. They always got worse in January when the cold settled into the joints, and the body directed its warmth inward, and the extremities were left to manage as best they could. He didn't complain. He never complained. He simply did less more slowly, and Elizabeth adjusted around him the way she always had, picking up what he set down without comment. But in January, she also noticed something she had not fully noticed before, or perhaps had noticed and had not let herself sit with her father, was tired in a way that went beyond the season. A deep tiredness. The kind that sleep addressed but did not entirely resolve. The kind that accumulated. She sat with that knowledge for 3 days before she spoke to Nathaniel about it. She told him on a Thursday evening after her father had gone to bed early. Another thing he was doing more often. Going to bed before 9, which was not the habit of the man she had grown up watching, read by firelight until 11. She told Nathaniel simply without decoration. My father is declining. Not quickly but genuinely. His hands, his energy, it's more than winter. It's time. Nathaniel was quiet. What does he need? He asked. Less, she said. He needs the farm to need less from him. He's been working at a level that his body has been arguing with for 2 years, and he's been winning the argument through sheer stubbornness, but... She stopped. He needs to be able to sit by the fire and read, and know that everything is handled. Is everything handled? Nathaniel asked. She looked at him. It was an honest question asked without implication, but it landed on the real thing, the thing she had been turning over since October, since the records office, since the review, since Thursday suppers, had become the rhythm of her weeks. The farm was protected now. The water rights were secure. Bennett had stepped back. But protection and security were not the same as thriving, and she knew the difference. The east field needs investment I don't have, she said. The barn needs a new roof section before spring. The drainage on the west side, I've been managing it with labor and time. But the real solution is an engineering fix that costs money I've been saving toward for 3 years and am still short of. She said it straight. No apology, no embarrassment. Just the ledger read aloud. Nathaniel listened. Let me help, he said. She looked at him. Not as a gift, he said before she could speak. Not as a debt, as a neighbor, as someone who has the resources and the knowledge and who... He stopped, started again. Elizabeth, let me help, as whatever I am to you, whatever that is. Whatever I am to you. She heard that. She heard the question inside it placed carefully without pressure, the way he placed everything with room for her to answer or not answer, to move toward or hold still. She was not a woman who held still when the honest thing was to move. You are, she said carefully, the most useful person I have met in my adult life. You are honest, which is rarer than useful. You are patient, which is rarer than honest. She paused. And you walk 4 miles in the cold to have a difficult conversation rather than sending a letter, which is the quality I find most. She paused again, choosing the word precisely. Most compelling. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. That is the most practical declaration of regard I have ever received, he said. I'm a practical person, she said. I know, he said. I find it... He used her word deliberately with the small, precise echo of a man who paid attention to language. Most compelling. The fire made its small sounds in the grate. Outside, January pressed against the house with the specific indifference of a Virginia winter that had no opinion about what was happening inside. Neither of them moved. Then Elizabeth said, "Help with the drainage, in the spring. I'll tell you what's needed, and you'll tell me what it costs, and we'll work out the terms, like people who respect each other's intelligence." Agreed, Nathaniel said. And supper on Thursdays, she said. Agreed, he said again. She stood up and picked up the lamp to carry it to the mantel, which was her signal that the evening was finished, and her guest should begin thinking about the door. It was a habit she had developed because she found direct statements of, "Please leave now," socially uncomfortable, in a way that the lamp signal was not. Nathaniel stood up and reached for his coat. Then he stopped. "There's something I need to say," he said. "Before Thursday becomes something it already is without being named." She turned. He was holding his coat and looking at her with the specific expression she had come to understand as his honest face. Not the public face, not the careful face, but the one underneath both of those, the one that appeared when he had decided that precision mattered more than protection. "I intend to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not tonight. I'm telling you in advance because you are a woman who prefers to know things before they arrive, and because I want you to have considered it fully before I ask, so that when you answer, you're certain." He paused. "I also want you to know that my asking will not depend on your answer. I mean that my regard for you, my investment in this farm, and your family, the Thursday suppers, none of that is conditional on a particular response from you. It exists independently. I want to be clear about that." Elizabeth stood with the lamp. She looked at him. She thought about a rainy road and a broken wheel and a man who had held a carriage frame steady in the mud and followed instructions without argument, and said, "Most things do, with the weight of a person who had earned the right to say it." She thought about 4 months of watching and finding no limit to what he actually was. She thought about her father and the cedar box and the 15 years of quiet help that had come without announcement and the particular shape of a family. The Whitmores who expressed love through action so quietly that the recipients sometimes didn't know for 15 years. She thought, "I am done waiting to know things I already know." "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes," he said. "Ask now," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he set his coat back on the chair. He crossed to where she was standing, and he stopped in front of her close enough to be deliberate, far enough to be respectful, and he said, "Elizabeth Carter, you are the most honest person I have ever known. You are the most capable, and the most clear-eyed, and the most genuinely good, in the oldest sense of that word, without performance or apology. I have been trying to deserve your good opinion since October, and I intend to keep trying for the rest of my life if you'll allow it." He paused. "Will you marry me?" Elizabeth set the lamp on the mantel. She turned to face him fully. "Yes," she said. "On the condition that we are honest with each other from here forward. Completely. Even when it's complicated." "Agreed," he said. "And that Carter Farm remains Carter Farm," she said. "In name and in management." "I would expect nothing else," he said. "And that my father stays on this land for the rest of his life, with whatever he needs." "That was never in question," Nathaniel said. She looked at him for one more moment, checking in the way she always checked the space between what was said and what was true. She found no space. She found the thing itself solid and clear. "Then yes," she said again, completely and without reservation. She told her father in the morning. She came to his room before breakfast, which was unusual enough that he was already sitting up and looking at her with the attentive expression of a man who has learned to read his daughter's arrivals. She sat in the chair beside his bed. "Nathaniel asked me to marry him last night," she said. Her father was quiet. "I said yes," she said. Thomas Carter looked at his hands at the trembling that had become simply part of what they were. Then he looked up at his daughter. "Are you certain?" he asked. Not doubtfully, carefully. The question of a man who had raised a woman who did not do things without being certain and who still wanted to hear her say it. "I have been watching him for 4 months, Elizabeth said. "I have been looking for the thing that doesn't match. The limitation, the condition, the place where the quality ends." She paused. "I haven't found it." "You may not find everything in 4 months, her father said. "No," she agreed. "But I've found enough to trust that what I'll find later is worth finding." She paused. "And I've found that I want to keep looking. That is new for me. That matters." Thomas Carter was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "His father was a good man." "You keep saying that," Elizabeth said. "It keeps being relevant," he said. She almost laughed. She did not quite laugh because the moment was serious, but something in her chest released with a warmth that felt close enough to laughter to count. Her father reached out and put his hand over hers. The trembling translated through his palm into hers. She felt it, that faint, constant motion, and she held his hand the way she'd been holding it for years, steady, without drawing attention to the steadiness. "Your mother would have liked him," Thomas Carter said. "She would have asked him 17 questions before she decided," Elizabeth said. She would have decided in the first 5 minutes and used the other 12 to make him prove it. Her father said, "She was more like you than you know." Elizabeth squeezed his hand once. "Come to breakfast," she said. "I'll make the good coffee." They were married in March, not with great ceremony. Neither of them wanted ceremony, which was one of the things they had established in the 3 months between January's conversation and the spring. They were married in the Augusta County Courthouse on a Tuesday morning with Prescott as witness, and Martha Dill as the second, and Thomas Carter, standing beside his daughter, with his hands in his best coat pockets, where no one could see them shake. There was no procession, no flowers, no feast. But Martha had made a small cake because Martha was the kind of woman who knew that some things deserved to be marked, even when the people involved were not marking them loudly, and she brought it to the Carter farm that evening, and set it on the table without comment and cut it into 4 pieces, and that was the wedding supper. Thomas Carter ate 2 pieces, which was more than he usually ate of anything, and said it was the best cake he'd had in years, and Martha said she knew it was, and accepted the compliment with the composure of a woman who had never once underestimated herself. What happened after was not a fairy tale. It was life, real life, the kind that required constant attention, and generated constant work, and occasionally broke things at the worst possible moment, and demanded that you fix them with whatever you had in your hands. The drainage project on the West Field took longer than planned because the spring was wet and the ground didn't cooperate. The barn roof was completed in June correctly, and Elizabeth stood inside it during the first summer thunderstorm and listened to the sound of rain on good cedar, and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem that had been solved correctly. Thomas Carter's health continued its slow accounting. But he had his chair by the fire, and he had his books, and he had his daughter at supper every evening, and he had a man across the table who listened to him, and argued with him, and deferred to him on the things that were his to know, and didn't defer on the things where he was wrong, which Thomas Carter respected more than any deference. Bennett made no further approach. Valley land interests appeared in no new county filings. Whether this was permanent or temporary, Elizabeth did not speculate about aloud. She kept the cedar box. She kept the records. She kept her relationship with Prescott and with Martha Dill and with Robert Morgan, who turned 82 in April, and sent word that he was glad things had come out correctly. The East Field produced well that summer, better than it had in 3 years. Elizabeth stood at the field's edge on an August evening, watching the last light go out of the sky over the limestone shelf that her grandfather had chosen, without knowing why he was choosing it, and that a man named Robert Whitmore had identified as worth saving 15 years ago, and that she had spent the better part of a year protecting with documents and county filings and sheer stubbornness. She heard Nathaniel come to stand beside her. I didn't say anything. Neither did she. They stood and looked at the field in the way people looked at something they had worked for, not with triumph, which was loud, but with the quieter thing that came after, which was simply knowledge. This is real. This is ours. We did what was required. The broken wheel, Nathaniel said finally. She looked at him. I've been thinking about it, he said. I pass that bend in the road sometimes, and I think about that particular evening. How close it came to not happening. If the rain had come an hour earlier, you'd have been home already. If you'd taken a different road. If you'd decided a wheel in the mud was someone else's problem. I don't decide things are someone else's problem, Elizabeth said. I know, he said. That's exactly what I think about. She looked back at the field. I think about it too, she said. But not the same way. I think about how many things had to happen before that moment for us to be standing at that bend at the same time. Your father and my father on a road in, when was it, 1801? 01, he said. 1801, Nathaniel confirmed. Wait, 801, she said. A lame horse. A man who helped a stranger. 20 years of a kindness moving forward through time, finding the shape it was going to take. And then a rainy October evening, and a wheel that broke at exactly the right place, at exactly the right moment. She paused. I don't think it was chance. No, Nathaniel said. I don't think so either. They stood in the quiet of a summer evening in the Shenandoah Valley, on land that had been held through drought and flood, and 15 years of a man who had tried to take it, and they stood together in the way they had learned to stand close enough to be present to each other, with enough space for each of them to be entirely themselves. Nathaniel reached over and took her hand. She let him. The broken wheel from the Staunton Road stayed at Carter Farm, not on display, not mounted somewhere to be admired or explained to visitors. It leaned against the back wall of the barn where the cedar smell was strongest between the mended harness and the spare fence post timber. If you knew to look for it, you found it. If you didn't know, it was simply an old wheel in a barn, which was what it was. Elizabeth's children. There were 3, eventually. 2 girls and a boy, all of them with their mother's directness and their father's patience, which proved to be a combination that served them well in a world that required both, grew up knowing the story of the wheel. Not as a legend, not as a romantic tale, as the plain account of an evening in October 1817, when a woman saw something that needed doing and did it, and a man saw a woman doing it and understood what he was looking at, and everything that followed came from those 2 simple acts of paying attention. The eldest daughter asked once, when she was perhaps 10, why they kept the wheel if it was broken. Elizabeth thought about the question with the seriousness she gave everything. Because it reminds us, she said, that the most important things that ever happened to this family happened while someone was doing ordinary work on an ordinary road. Not in a grand house, not in a courtroom, on a road in the rain with mud on their hands. She paused. We keep it so we don't forget where we come from. And so we don't forget that the work, the ordinary, necessary, unglamorous work, is never below us. Her daughter looked at the wheel for a long moment. What if the wheel had been fixed already? She asked. What if it hadn't broken? Elizabeth looked at her daughter. This child who had her father's gray eyes and her grandmother's habit of asking the question underneath the question, and she said, then something else would have happened. Because your father and I were always going to find each other. We were built from the same material. Honest people find each other eventually. She paused. The wheel just moved the timeline. Her daughter accepted this. Elizabeth Carter Whitmore lived on that land for the rest of her life. She managed it and fought for it and watched it grow and taught her children to read surveys and understand water rights and negotiate with grain merchants without flinching. She sat with her father in his final years and read to him by firelight the way he had once read to her. She buried him on the east field on the elevated ground above the limestone shelf where the drainage was good and the soil held its character through every weather. She was never once told she had done something remarkable, by which the tellers meant something beyond the ordinary scope of a woman's life. She never corrected them. She knew what she had done. She knew the size of it, not with pride exactly, but with the clear-eyed accounting of a woman who had looked at every piece of her life directly and called each thing by its right name. She had held a farm. She had held a family. She had found a man worth finding, and trusted him worth trusting, and built something with him that lasted. She had looked at a broken wheel on a rainy road and seen what it needed and done it without hesitation, without waiting for permission, without asking whether it was her place. It had always been her place. That was the truth. She had known her entire life, and that no one and nothing, not poverty, not doubt, not 15 years of a man's patient predation, not the particular cruelty of a world that looked at a woman with mud on her hands and saw only the mud had ever been able to take from her. Her worth had never been hidden. It had been there constant and undiminished from the very beginning. She had simply never stopped knowing it. And in the end, that was the thing that changed everything. Not the wheel, not the rain, not even the man who had come back to find her. Just a woman who knew exactly what she was worth and never for a single moment let the